Beneath the surface of still waters, some wounds refuse to heal. Some scars remain invisible to all but those who bear them. In the quiet coastal town of Point Haven, where fog clings to the cliffs and secrets ride on salt-laden winds, two broken souls are about to collide. One, a former combat medic haunted by those she couldn't save. The other, a remarkable creature born of science and suffering, fleeing from those who would use him as a weapon. What is freedom worth to those who've lost everything? How far would you go to protect a life that saved your own? Some connections transcend understanding. Some battles must be fought alone. And sometimes in the darkest storms, it's not the strongest who survive, but those who refuse to surrender. This is their story. The explosion ripped through the air, a deafening roar that drowned out the screams. Dust and debris rained down like hellish confetti as the building collapsed in on itself. Somewhere beneath the chaos, a radio crackled with desperate voices calling for help. "Echo team, do you copy? We need immediate evac casualties reported." The voice cut off abruptly as Medical Officer Elena Kowalski scrambled through the rubble, her hands raw and bleeding as she clawed at concrete and twisted metal. The Afghan sun beat down mercilessly, turning the battlefield into an oven of dust and desperation. "Barnes Martinez!" Elena screamed, her throat burning from the caustic air. "Rodriguez Thompson!" She had seen them enter the building only moments before. Four of her team, her friends, her responsibility. Now there was only smoke and silence. A soldier appeared through the haze, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. Elena lunged forward, grabbing him by his tactical vest and dragging him behind a crumbling wall as gunfire erupted nearby. "Stay with me," she ordered, applying pressure to his wound. "Breathe. Just breathe." Her eyes never stopped scanning the burning building, calculating angles, searching for a way in. The wounded soldier grabbed her wrist. "Don't," he rasped. "It's too hot, too unstable." Elena shook her head. "They're still in there." She started to rise, but a secondary explosion thundered through the village, more powerful than the first. The shock wave hit her like a freight train, lifting her off her feet and slamming her back down onto the unforgiving earth. The world went white. Rain pounded against the windows of the small fishing boat, each drop a tiny hammer striking the glass. The Oregon coast had vanished behind a wall of gray, leaving only the angry sea in every direction. Elena Kowalski stood at the helm of the Phoenix, her weathered hands gripping the wheel with practiced strength. Her face, tanned and lined beyond her 38 years, remained impassive as she guided the vessel through the churning waters. The storm had caught her by surprise, rolling in from the Pacific with unusual speed and ferocity. Most sensible fishermen had returned to harbor hours ago, but Elena had pushed her luck, staying out longer than she should have. Now she was paying the price, fighting her way back to Point Haven through weather that seemed determined to swallow her whole. She adjusted course, wincing as pain shot through her right leg. The old injury always flared in bad weather, as if determined to remind her of what she'd lost. The doctors had done their best, but some wounds went deeper than bone and tissue. Some could never fully heal. A flash of lightning split the sky, momentarily illuminating the raging seascape around her. In that brief electric instant, Elena caught sight of something in the water, a dark shape thrashing amid the waves, too large to be driftwood, too animated to be debris. She reached for her binoculars, steadying herself against the boat's violent rocking. Through the rain-streaked lenses, she focused on the distant form. What the hell? It wasn't possible. Not this far out, not in this storm. But there it was, the unmistakable silhouette of a horse struggling desperately against the merciless pull of the ocean. Without hesitation, Elena spun the wheel, turning the Phoenix toward the floundering animal. Years of military training kicked in, pushing aside questions of how or why. There was only the mission now: reach the target, secure extract. "Hang on," she muttered, though there was no one to hear her words. "Just hang on." The boat lurched violently as she fought the current, drawing closer to the drowning horse. It was nearly submerged now, only its head and part of its neck visible above the churning surface. Elena cut the engine, knowing she couldn't risk getting too close with the propellers still running. Grabbing a length of rope, she secured one end to the boat and looped the other around her waist. The wind howled around her as she stepped onto the edge of the deck rain, lashing her face like tiny whips. For a split second, she hesitated. This was madness. She could die out here trying to save an animal that was likely already doomed. Then those dark, wild eyes found hers across the water eyes that held a depth of terror and determination that struck Elena to her core. In that gaze, she recognized something intimately familiar, the look of a soul that refused to surrender to death. Elena dove into the frigid water. The cold hit her like a physical blow, knocking the breath from her lungs. Her leg immediately seized with pain, but she forced herself forward, powerful strokes carrying her toward the struggling horse. The waves worked against her, each one threatening to push her under to end her rescue before it began. When she finally reached the animal, it was barely staying afloat. Its coat was midnight black, sleek with water, and strangely beautiful even in its distress. Elena grabbed onto its mane, careful to approach from the side to avoid being struck by its thrashing hooves. "Easy!" she called over the roar of the storm. "Easy now!" The horse's eyes rolled wildly, but something in Elena's voice seemed to reach it. It stopped fighting quite so hard, allowing her to slip the rope around its neck in a loose harness. Getting back to the boat was an exercise in pure will. Elena's injured leg had gone nearly numb, and every pull on the rope sent daggers of pain through her shoulder. The horse was heavy, its strength nearly spent, and it took everything she had to guide it toward the Phoenix. By the time they reached the vessel, Elena's vision was starting to blur. Using the last reserves of her strength, she hauled herself aboard and began the arduous process of bringing the horse up alongside. She had a small crane meant for hauling in large catches. Never had she imagined using it for something like this. It took nearly an hour of backbreaking effort before the horse lay on the deck, its sides heaving with exhausted breaths. Elena collapsed beside it, her own lungs burning, her body trembling with cold and exertion. As the rain continued to pour down on them both, she reached out a shaking hand and rested it against the animal's neck, feeling the strong, steady pulse beneath her fingers. A strange sense of kinship washed over her, two survivors adrift in a hostile world refusing to be claimed by the sea. "You and me," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the storm. "We're not done yet." The horse's eye, dark as midnight and ringed with exhaustion, regarded her with an intelligence that seemed almost human. For the first time in years, Elena felt something crack within her, something that had been frozen solid since that dusty day in Afghanistan, when she'd lost everything that mattered. She didn't know what it was, this strange connection. But as the Phoenix limped back toward shore, with its unlikely passenger, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed, that in saving this creature, she had somehow altered the course of her own fate. The small coastal house stood alone on the cliffs overlooking the ocean, its weathered cedar siding and salt-stained windows a testament to years of enduring Pacific storms. It wasn't much to look at, just a simple two-bedroom structure with a detached barn that had seen better days, but it was Elena's refuge, the place she had retreated to after everything fell apart. She pulled her truck up to the barn, the horse sedated and secured in the makeshift transport she'd rigged in the bed. Getting it from the harbor to her home had been a logistical nightmare, one she'd only managed with the reluctant help of a few local fishermen who owed her favors. Her leg throbbed mercilessly as she climbed down from the cab, a reminder of the toll the rescue had taken. She ignored it, focusing instead on the task at hand. The barn hadn't been used for animals in years, not since her parents had died and left her the property, but it would have to do. With painstaking care, Elena coaxed the still groggy horse into the barn, settling it on a bed of fresh straw she'd hastily purchased from the general store in town. The animal moved with surprising docility, as if sensing her intentions were good. Once the horse was settled, Elena took her first real opportunity to examine it properly. It was a stallion, she now realized, younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 4 or 5 years old. His coat was a deep, lustrous black that seemed to absorb light, broken only by a jagged white marking on his forehead that resembled a lightning bolt. "Storm," she said quietly, the name coming to her unbidden. "That's what I'll call you." The horse's ears flicked at the sound of her voice, but his attention seemed focused elsewhere. Elena followed his gaze, noting with curiosity that he was oriented precisely toward the east as if drawn by some invisible force. As she continued her examination, Elena's medical training kicked in. The horse was underweight but muscular, suggesting he hadn't been wild his entire life. There were scars along his flanks, old injuries that had healed poorly, but what caught her attention most were the unusual burns around his eyes, perfect hexagonal patterns that couldn't possibly be natural. "What happened to you?" she murmured, reaching out slowly. Storm flinched away from her, touched nostrils flaring. Elena withdrew her hand, respecting his boundary. She'd seen enough trauma both in war and in its aftermath to recognize the signs. This horse had suffered at human hands. It would take time to earn his trust. With a sigh, Elena left the barn, securing the door behind her. Night had fallen, and the storm that had nearly claimed them both continued to rage against the coastline. She limped up the porch steps of the main house, her body crying out for rest, for medication, for the numbing embrace of whiskey. Inside the house was just as she'd left it that morning, sparse, functional, and haunted by ghosts only she could see. Military precision kept the space clean, but did nothing to make it feel like a home. There were no family photos on display, no mementos of a life before the war. The only personal touches were 5 crystal tumblers arranged in a neat row on the kitchen counter and 4 framed photographs face down in a drawer she rarely opened. Elena moved to the counter, her ritual as automatic as breathing. She lined up the glasses, poured 2 fingers of whiskey into each one, and stared at them in silence. 4 for the friends she couldn't save, 1 for herself, the survivor, who sometimes wished she wasn't. She downed her glass in a single swallow, feeling the familiar burn as it traced a path down her throat. She never touched the other 4. Those were for ghosts. A knock at the door startled her from her reverie. Elena tensed her hand instinctively, reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Few people came to her home, and never this late. "Elena, you in there?" "It's Howard." The tension in her shoulders eased slightly. Howard Mackenzie was one of the few locals she tolerated, an older man who ran the town's hardware store and seemed to understand her need for space. Unlike the others in Point Haven, he never pushed her to get involved or be part of the community. She opened the door to find him standing on her porch, his 70-year-old frame straight and tall despite the driving rain. He held a paper bag in one hand and a concerned expression on his weather-beaten face. "Heard you pulled a horse out of the ocean today," he said without preamble. "Thought you might need these." He held up the bag, which clinked with the sound of pill bottles. Elena's jaw tightened. "I'm fine." "Sure you are." Howard's steel gray eyes, sharp despite his age, took in her pallor, the way she favored her right leg. "And I'm the Queen of England." Despite herself, Elena felt the corner of her mouth twitch. She stepped back, allowing him to enter. Howard set the bag on the counter, tactfully ignoring the row of filled glasses. He'd been a medic in Vietnam, and something in his quiet dignity had always reminded Elena of her father. Perhaps that was why she tolerated his occasional intrusions. "Doc Liam sent these over," Howard said, removing several prescription bottles from the bag. "Said you missed your last 3 appointments." Elena shrugged. "Don't need them." "The limp and the circles under your eyes suggest otherwise?" Howard's voice was gentle but firm. "You're pushing too hard again, Elena. The PTSD meds." "I don't have PTSD," she cut him off, the lie automatic and hollow. Howard's expression didn't change. "Complex PTSD doesn't just go away because you're too stubborn to acknowledge it." Elena turned away, unwilling to continue the conversation. Her gaze fell on the window that faced the barn where her unusual rescue now rested. "That horse," Howard said, following her line of sight. "What are you planning to do with it?" "I don't know yet." It was the truth. Elena hadn't thought beyond saving the animal's life. "Call animal control, I guess, once the storm passes." Howard nodded slowly. "Might want to have Liam take a look at it first. Make sure it's stable enough for transport." Elena didn't respond, but she knew he was right. The horse storm needed proper medical attention, more than her field training could provide. Howard placed a hand briefly on her shoulder, the touch light and respectful. "There's food in the bag, too. Try to eat something real for a change." He moved toward the door, then paused. "And Elena, taking the meds doesn't mean you're weak. Sometimes the strongest thing you can do is admit you need help." After he left, Elena stood motionless in the center of her kitchen, Howard's words echoing in her mind. With a frustrated sigh, she grabbed one of the pill bottles, examining the label with a clinical detachment. The same medication they'd prescribed after she'd been evacuated from Afghanistan, when the nightmares had been so bad she couldn't close her eyes without seeing the explosion, without hearing the screams of men she couldn't reach. She'd stopped taking them months ago, convinced she could handle the symptoms on her own. But lately the dreams had been returning, with renewed intensity, leaving her gasping and sweat-soaked in the pre-dawn hours. Elena placed the bottle back in the bag without opening it. Tomorrow, perhaps. Tonight she had a horse to check on. The barn was dark and quiet when Elena returned, a battery-powered lantern in one hand and her medical kit in the other. Storm stood exactly where she'd left him, his body still oriented toward the east, as if he were a compass needle drawn to some invisible magnetic field. "Hey there," she said softly, hanging the lantern on a hook. "Just checking on you." The horse's ears swiveled toward her voice, but his body remained motionless. In the gentle glow of the lantern, Elena could see his ribs more clearly beneath the drying coat. Someone had starved him, or he'd been lost for some time before ending up in the ocean. Elena moved slowly, making sure he could track her movements. She set down her kit and pulled out a stethoscope, the same one she'd carried through 2 tours in Afghanistan. "I'm going to listen to your heart and lungs," she explained, keeping her voice low and steady. "I need to make sure you didn't inhale too much seawater." Storm watched her warily but didn't shy away as she approached. As she placed the stethoscope against his chest, she was struck again by the strange sensation that he understood her words, that there was an intelligence behind those dark eyes that went beyond animal instinct. His heartbeat was strong and regular, his breathing clear. No signs of pneumonia or secondary drowning. It was miraculous, really, considering what he'd been through. As Elena continued her examination, her fingers brushed against something hard embedded in the skin of his neck. Frowning, she parted the wet hair to reveal a small metal object partially submerged beneath the surface of his skin. It looked like some kind of tracking device, but unlike any she'd seen before, more sophisticated, with a strange iridescent sheen to the metal. "What the hell is this?" she murmured. Storm shifted uneasily, as if her discovery had triggered something in him. His hoof struck the ground in a sharp, deliberate pattern, 3 quick taps followed by 2 slower ones, then 3 more quick taps. The rhythm was too precise to be random. Elena pulled back, watching him with growing curiosity. As a combat medic, she'd been trained to notice patterns, to identify anomalies that might indicate a deeper problem. Everything about this horse was an anomaly. Turning her attention back to the device, Elena considered trying to remove it, but quickly decided against it. Without knowing what it was or how deeply it was embedded, she risked doing more harm than good. Better to wait for Liam, the local vet. As she packed up her medical kit, Storm began to paw at the ground again, this time with more urgency. The same pattern repeated: 3 quick, 2 slow, 3 quick. "Morse code!" Elena whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. It was SOS, the universal distress signal. She stared at the horse, a chill running down her spine that had nothing to do with her wet clothes or the cold barn. It wasn't possible. Horses didn't know Morse code. They didn't embed rhythmic patterns into their movements with such precision. Yet she couldn't deny what she'd seen. Either this was the most extraordinary coincidence, or there was something about Storm that defied rational explanation. Elena backed toward the door, suddenly uneasy. "I'll be back in the morning," she said, her voice less steady than before. "Try to get some rest." Outside, the rain had finally stopped leaving behind, a world washed clean and gleaming under the emerging stars. Elena stood on her porch, gazing out at the ocean that had nearly claimed them both. The wind carried the scent of salt and pine, a combination she'd found comforting since childhood. But tonight, not even the familiar landscape could soothe the unease that had taken root within her. Something wasn't right about the horse she'd rescued, something that went beyond unusual markings or embedded tracking devices. Elena's hand drifted to her right leg, massaging the old injury through her jeans. The doctors had told her she was lucky to keep the limb after the explosion. Metal fragments had shredded muscle and shattered bone, leaving behind a network of scars that resembled a roadmap to nowhere. She wasn't supposed to have survived. By all rights, she should have died alongside her team in that Afghan village. Sometimes in her darkest moments, she wished she had. A sudden sound from the barn snapped her back to the present, a sharp, distressed whinny that cut through the night like a blade. Elena was moving before she had time to think, her limp more pronounced as she hurried across the muddy yard. Inside, she found Storm in a state of agitation, his eyes wild, his powerful body trembling as he stared fixedly at the small window high on the eastern wall. "What is it?" Elena asked, approaching cautiously. "What's wrong?" As if in answer, the distinctive rumble of aircraft engines reached her ears, military aircraft from the sound of them. Navy fighters from the base down the coast, probably on a night training exercise. Storm's reaction was immediate and violent. He reared up forelegs, pawing at the air, a sound of pure terror erupting from his throat. His eyes were no longer those of a domesticated animal. They were feral, primal, consumed by a panic so profound it bordered on madness. "Hey, hey!" Elena moved forward instinctively, hands raised. "It's okay. Just planes. They can't hurt you." But Storm was beyond reassurance. He crashed back down to all fours and began to circle frantically, his hooves striking the ground in that same urgent pattern. 323, SOS. "Help me." Elena stayed with him until the planes passed and his terror subsided, speaking in the same calm, measured tones she'd once used with wounded soldiers. Gradually his breathing slowed, his eyes cleared, though he remained oriented toward the east, as if waiting for something or someone to appear on the horizon. When she finally returned to the house, exhaustion had settled into her bones like a physical weight. She sprawled on her couch, too tired to make it to the bedroom, her mind racing despite her body's demands for rest. The tracking device, the Morse code, the panic at the sound of military aircraft. None of it made sense, yet all of it pointed to something beyond a simple case of an animal lost at sea. Elena's last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was of those intelligent, haunted eyes that seemed to carry the same burden she saw each morning in the mirror. The weight of survival when those around you had perished. The crushing responsibility of being the one left behind. The nightmare came, as it always did, without warning and merciless in its clarity. She was back in the village, dust coating her throat, the sun a molten disk overhead. The radio crackled with static and desperate voices. Her team moved in formation toward the building that would become their tomb. She saw their faces with perfect clarity. Barnes with his perpetual 5 o'clock shadow, Martinez and his St. Christopher medal, Rodriguez's gap-toothed smile, Thompson's steady gaze. "Don't go in," Elena tried to shout, but no sound emerged. "It's a trap." They couldn't hear her. They never could. The scene played out exactly as it had that day. The approach, the entry, the moment of terrible silence before the world erupted into flame and shrapnel. But this time the dream shifted. As the building collapsed, a dark shape emerged from the smoke, a horse midnight black with a lightning bolt on its forehead. It stood amid the carnage, untouched by the chaos around it, staring directly at Elena with eyes that knew too much. 3 quick taps of its hoof. Too slow. 3 quick. SOS. Elena jerked awake, a cry trapped in her throat. Sweat soaked her clothes and her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape. For a moment she didn't know where she was, the boundary between dream and reality, blurred by the lingering tendrils of sleep. A sound cut through her disorientation, the high-pitched whinny of a horse in distress. Storm. She stumbled to her feet, ignoring the protest from her leg as she grabbed her jacket and rushed outside. Dawn was just breaking, painting the eastern sky in bands of gold and pink. The air was crisp and clean after the storm, carrying the promise of a clear day ahead. The sound came again, more urgent this time. Elena broke into an awkward run, crossing the yard to the barn in seconds. Inside, Storm was pacing frantically, his attention fixed on the small window that faced east. His nostrils flared wide and his coat shone with sweat despite the cool morning air. "What's wrong?" Elena asked, scanning the barn for signs of what might have upset him. Storm's only response was to increase his pacing, his hooves striking the ground in that same deliberate pattern she'd noticed the night before. SOS. Elena moved to the window, standing on tiptoe to peer outside. At first she saw nothing unusual, just the rutted dirt road that led to her property, the scrubby pines that dotted the landscape, and beyond them the distant glimmer of the ocean. Then a flash of movement caught her eye, a black SUV moving slowly along the road, its tinted windows reflecting the early morning light. It wasn't from Point Haven. Elena knew every vehicle in the small town. This was an outsider, and there was something deliberately stealthy in the way it crept along, as if the driver didn't want to attract attention. As she watched the SUV came to a stop at the turn that led to her driveway, it idled there for a long moment before continuing past, disappearing around a bend in the road. Elena stepped back from the window, her combat instincts on high alert. It could be nothing, a lost tourist perhaps, or someone scouting fishing spots. But combined with Storm's reaction and the strange device embedded in his neck, the presence of an unknown vehicle raised too many red flags to ignore. She turned back to the horse, who had finally stopped pacing and now stood watching her intently, as if waiting to see what she would do next. "You're not just some random horse that fell off a boat, are you?" she said quietly. Storm's ears pricked forward at the sound of her voice. Then, to Elena's astonishment, he deliberately shook his head from side to side, a clear, unmistakable no. The breath caught in Elena's throat. It was one thing to suspect the horse possessed unusual intelligence. It was another entirely to witness such a human-like response to a direct question. "Do you know who was in that vehicle?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Storm nodded, a single dip of his proud head. Elena felt as if the floor had dropped out from beneath her feet. She was having a conversation, an actual exchange of information with a horse. Either she had finally lost her grip on reality, or she had stumbled into something far stranger and potentially more dangerous than she could have imagined. "Are they looking for you?" Another nod, more emphatic this time. Elena ran a hand through her tangled hair, trying to make sense of what was happening. "And they're dangerous." The horse pawed the ground, his eyes never leaving hers. 3 quick taps. "Too slow. 3 quick." The message couldn't have been clearer if he'd spoken the words aloud. "Okay," Elena said, making a decision. "Then we need to know more about what we're dealing with." She approached Storm slowly, her hand extended, palm up, in a gesture of peace. "I need to look at that thing in your neck again. Will you let me?" The horse regarded her for a long moment, his dark eyes assessing. Then, with deliberate care, he lowered his head, presenting the side of his neck where the device was embedded. Elena's fingers were gentle as she parted the coarse hair to reveal the metal object. In the clear morning light, she could see it more distinctly, a small disc, no larger than a quarter, partially submerged beneath the skin. The metal had an unusual sheen, almost opalescent, and there were tiny markings etched into its surface. "I need a better look," she murmured, more to herself than to Storm. Returning to the house, Elena grabbed her first aid kit and a magnifying glass from her desk. When she returned to the barn, Storm hadn't moved still, waiting patiently with his head lowered. Under magnification, the markings on the device became clearer, a series of alphanumeric characters that meant nothing to Elena. But as she shifted the hair further aside, she noticed something else, a small tattoo on the skin beside the device, nearly invisible against the dark coat. "WL-422, she read aloud. Storm's reaction was immediate. He jerked his head up, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. The sound that escaped him was unlike any horse noise Elena had ever heard, a high keening whine that raised the hair on the back of her neck. "What is it?" she asked, stepping back. "What does that mean?" But Storm had retreated into himself, his eyes vacant, his body trembling slightly. Whatever WL-422 signified, it had triggered something profound in him, a memory perhaps, or a conditioned response. Elena knew she needed help. This was beyond her medical training, beyond her experience with trauma. She needed someone who understood animals, who might make sense of the bizarre behavior she was witnessing. And more than that, she needed information about the mysterious code in the tracking device. Something told her that the black SUV wouldn't be the last uninvited visitor to her property. If Storm was right, if these people were dangerous, then she needed to be prepared. Back in the house, Elena booted up her rarely used laptop. The internet connection was spotty this far from town, but it would have to do. She typed WL-422 into the search bar and hit enter. The results were sparse and unhelpful, mostly technical specifications for parts and equipment that had nothing to do with animals or tracking devices. She tried various combinations: WL-422 horse, WL-422 tracking, WL-422 military. It was the last search that yielded something interesting, a brief mention in a military technology forum about a classified project called Wildlight, reportedly focused on enhanced biometric integration for field applications. The post had been deleted shortly after being published, but fragments remained in the cached version. Elena stared at the screen, a cold feeling settling in her stomach. Wild light. WF. The first two letters of the code tattooed on Storm's neck. Her phone rang, startling her out of her thoughts. The caller ID showed a name she hadn't seen in years, Mason Taylor, her former squad mate, the only other survivor from that fateful day in Afghanistan. Elena hesitated, her finger hovering over the screen. She and Mason had parted on difficult terms after their medical discharges. He had wanted to stay in touch to process their shared trauma together. She had wanted to forget, to bury the past along with the friends they'd lost. After a moment, she answered, "Mason." "Elena." His voice was exactly as she remembered it, deep, steady, with a slight southern drawl that years in the military had never quite erased. "It's been a while. 3 years, 2 months." She hadn't meant to keep such precise track, but the numbers were there in her head regardless. There was a pause, and Elena could almost see him nodding on the other end of the line, accepting the correction without comment. Mason had always understood her need for precision, for control over the small details, when the larger ones spun beyond her grasp. "I heard about your rescue yesterday," he said finally. "Word travels fast, even in government circles." Elena tensed. "What government circles?" Another pause, longer this time. "I work for the Bureau of Land Management now. Oversight Division for Federal Land Use in the Pacific Northwest." Sir. It was a plausible explanation for how he might have heard about a horse rescue off the Oregon coast, but something in his tone made Elena suspicious. Mason had always been a terrible liar. "What do you want, Mason?" "To help." The words came quickly, almost rehearsed. "That horse you pulled out of the ocean, it's not just any horse, Elena. It's part of something complicated." "WL 422, she said, testing his reaction. "Wild light." The sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line told her everything she needed to know. Mason was involved, somehow knew something about the mysterious project and Storm's connection to it. "How do you," he began, then cut himself off. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped to a near whisper. "Don't say those words on an open line. Don't search them online again. And whatever you do, don't tell anyone else about the horse." "Why?" Elena demanded. "What's going on, Mason?" "I can't explain over the phone." The urgency in his voice was genuine, at least. "I'm driving up from Portland now. I'll be there by evening." "No." Elena's refusal was instinctive. The last thing she wanted was Mason Taylor in her space, dredging up memories she'd worked so hard to suppress. "Whatever this is, I don't want any part of it." "It's too late for that." Mason's voice softened slightly. "The moment you pulled that horse from the ocean, you became part of it. And Elena, these people, they won't just go away. They'll come for the horse, and they won't care who gets hurt in the process." The black SUV flashed through her mind the way it had idled at her driveway, watching, waiting. "Who are these people?" she asked. "I'll explain everything when I get there. In the meantime, stay alert. If anyone comes asking about the horse, you haven't seen anything. Understand?" Before she could respond, Mason ended the call, leaving Elena staring at her phone in frustrated silence. She set it down on the kitchen counter, her mind racing. Part of her wanted to call animal control immediately to wash her hands of whatever complicated situation she'd stumbled into. But a stronger part, the part that had driven her into a storm-tossed sea to save a drowning horse, couldn't abandon Storm now. Through the window, she could see the barn where he waited, oriented as always toward the east. Whatever secrets he carried, whatever danger he represented, they were bound together now by the simple fact of survival. She had pulled him from the sea. She wouldn't throw him back to the wolves now. Elena moved to the cabinet above the refrigerator, where a locked box held the one possession she'd kept from her military days, a 9mm Beretta, meticulously maintained and loaded. She hadn't fired it since her discharge, but her hands remembered the weight, the balance, the deadly purpose. Tucking the weapon into the waistband of her jeans, Elena headed for the door. She needed to call Liam, the local vet, to examine Storm properly. She needed to set up security cameras around her property. And most of all, she needed answers that began with the mysterious code tattooed on a black horse's neck and ended where, as she stepped outside, the morning sun broke fully over the horizon, bathing the landscape in golden light. A new day bringing with it unknown challenges and dangers. But for the first time in years, Elena felt something stir within her that wasn't grief or guilt or pain. Purpose, direction, a mission. She straightened her shoulders and headed toward the barn where Storm waited with his secrets and his silent pleas for help. Whatever came next, they would face it together, two survivors against the tide. Dr. Liam Garcia had been Point Haven's veterinarian for 15 years, inheriting the practice from his father before him. At 40, he had the calm demeanor of a man who had seen it all when it came to animals, from household pets to the occasional injured wildlife that washed up on shore. But as he examined the black stallion in Elena's barn, his professional composure showed signs of cracking. "This isn't normal," he murmured, running his hands along Storm's flanks. "These burn patterns around the eyes, I've never seen anything like them." Elena stood nearby, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What about the device in his neck?" Liam frowned, parting the coarse hair to reveal the metallic disc. "It's not like any tracking chip I've ever seen. More sophisticated, and it's been implanted surgically with precision." He glanced up at Elena, his dark eyes troubled. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing." "Can you remove it?" Liam hesitated. "I could, but without knowing what it is or how deeply it's connected to the surrounding tissue, I'd be working blind. Could cause nerve damage, bleeding." He shook his head. "I'd need better equipment, maybe even a specialist." Elena nodded, having expected as much. "What about his eyes? You said the burns were unusual." "They're not just burns," Liam said carefully, lifting one of Storm's eyelids. "There's evidence of surgical modification here too. See these tiny scars at the corner? Precision work, just like the implant." He pulled a small pen light from his pocket and shone it briefly into Storm's eye. The pupil contracted normally, but then something extraordinary happened. A faint reddish glow emanated from deep within the eye, like the reflection from a cat's eye, but distinctly different in color and intensity. "What the hell?" Liam jerked back, nearly dropping the pen light. "What is it?" Elena stepped forward, alarmed by his reaction. "I don't," Liam began, then stopped, collecting himself. "Let me try something." From his medical bag, he extracted a small device that resembled a remote control. "Infrared thermometer," he explained, pointing it at Storm. "Usually use it to check for inflammation without touching sensitive areas." He pressed a button, and a narrow beam of invisible light projected from the device. Storm's reaction was immediate and astonishing. He turned directly toward the beam, tracking it with precise movements as Liam moved it slowly across the barn. "He can see it," Liam whispered, awe and disbelief mingling in his voice. "He's tracking the infrared beam. Horses can't do that. Their eyes don't perceive that part of the spectrum." Elena felt a chill run down her spine. "What are you saying?" Liam lowered the thermometer, his expression grave. "I'm saying someone has surgically modified this horse's eyes to see infrared light. That's That's not just advanced veterinary medicine, Elena. That's something else entirely." Storm nickered softly, drawing their attention back to him. He had resumed his eastward orientation, standing perfectly still, like a sentinel awaiting orders. "I should take a blood sample," Liam said, reaching for his kit. "Check for unusual compounds, maybe get some DNA analyzed." As he prepared the syringe, Elena noticed Storm growing increasingly agitated, his ears pinned back, muscles tensing beneath his sleek coat. "Wait," she said, placing a hand on Liam's arm. "He doesn't like that." Liam paused, syringe in hand. "It's just a standard procedure. Won't hurt him much." But Storm was backing away now, his eyes fixed on the needle with what Elena could only describe as recognition and fear. "He's been through this before," she realized aloud. "Whatever they did to him, it involved needles, tests." Liam hesitated, clearly, torn between professional necessity and compassion for the animal's obvious distress. "I really should get a sample, Elena, especially if there's something unusual in his bloodstream." "Let me try," she said, holding out her hand for the syringe. With reluctance, Liam passed it to her. Elena approached Storm slowly, speaking in the same calm, steady voice she'd used during his rescue. "Hey there," she murmured. "I know you're scared. I know this reminds you of bad things. But we're trying to help you. Understand, we need to know what they did to you so we can fix it." To Liam's evident amazement, Storm gradually stilled his eyes, never leaving Elena's face. There was a moment of silent communication between them, an understanding that transcended species. That's it, Elena continued, gently taking hold of his halter with one hand while positioning the syringe with the other. Just a quick pinch, and then it's over. Storm flinched slightly as the needle entered his neck, but otherwise remained perfectly still. When Elena withdrew the blood-filled syringe, he released a long, shuddering breath, as if he'd been holding it the entire time. Remarkable, Liam said, accepting the sample from Elena. I've never seen a horse respond to human speech like that, especially not one with his history of trauma. Elena stroked Storm's neck, avoiding the area around the implant. He understands more than he should, she said quietly. Much more. Liam packed the blood sample carefully into his kit. I'll run the basic tests at my clinic, but for the more advanced analysis, I'll need to send it to a lab in Portland. Might take a few days for results. How discreet can you be? Elena asked, thinking of Mason's warning. Liam gave her a curious look. As discreet as needed. Why is there something you're not telling me? Elena hesitated, weighing her options. Liam was trustworthy as far as she knew, but Mason's warning had been explicit. Tell no one about the horse. Just concerned about animal rights activists, she said, finally, the lie tasting bitter on her tongue. If they hear about a horse with experimental modifications, they might cause problems before we know what we're dealing with. Liam nodded, accepting her explanation without question. I'll keep it quiet. List him as a standard rescue case on the paperwork. After he left, Elena stood for a long time with her hand resting on Storm's powerful shoulder, feeling the steady rhythm of his breathing. There was something comforting in his solid presence, despite the mystery and potential danger he represented. What happened to you? She whispered. What were you part of? Storm turned his head slightly, regarding her with those intelligent, haunted eyes. For a moment, Elena could have sworn she saw something flicker in their depths, a longing to communicate, to share the burden of knowledge he carried. A distant rumble caught her attention, another aircraft flying low over the coastline. She tensed, expecting Storm to react with the same panic he'd shown the previous night, but this time he remained calm, his only response a slight flattening of his ears. You're getting braver, she said, impressed by his self-control. As if in response, Storm gently bumped his nose against her shoulder, a gesture so unexpectedly affectionate that Elena found herself smiling for the first time in what felt like years. The moment was interrupted by the chime of her security system, a simple camera setup that sent alerts to her phone when motion was detected at the property's entrance. Elena pulled out her phone to see a black SUV parked at the end of her driveway, identical to the one she'd spotted that morning. Storm immediately sensed her tension, his body going rigid, his ears pricked forward in alert. Stay here, Elena told him, already moving toward the door. I'll handle this. Outside, she could see the vehicle more clearly through her binoculars. Government plates, tinted windows, 2 occupants in the front seats. They hadn't approached the house yet, seemingly content to observe from a distance. Elena's hand moved to the Beretta at her waistband, taking comfort in its solid presence. She had no intention of starting a confrontation, but if these people were as dangerous as Mason had implied, she wouldn't be caught unprepared. As she watched, the passenger door opened and a man in a dark suit stepped out. He was tall and lean, with the rigid posture of military training. Though he wore sunglasses, Elena could feel his gaze sweeping the property, assessing, calculating. Her phone rang, Mason's number flashing on the screen. Are they there yet? He asked without preamble when she answered. Black SUV at the end of my driveway, Elena confirmed, keeping her voice low. Government plates, 2 men possibly armed. Don't engage, Mason instructed. Don't even let them see you if possible. I'm about an hour out. Just sit tight until I arrive. And if they decide not to wait, if they come to the house? There was a brief silence on the line. Then you never saw a horse, Mason said finally. You were out fishing yesterday, came home late, haven't been down to the beach. Whatever they ask, whatever they claim, you know nothing. I'm not much of an actress, Mason. Then be the soldier I remember, he replied, his voice hardening. The one who could lie to commanding officers with a straight face when it meant protecting her team. The memory stung, a mission gone wrong, Elena covering for a rookie's mistake to save him from disciplinary action. She'd been good at it, than the necessary deception that kept her people safe. Fine, she said, her jaw tight. 1 hour. but you better have some damn good explanations when you get here." She ended the call and turned her attention back to the SUV. The man had returned to the vehicle, and after a moment it backed out of her driveway and headed down the road in the direction of town. Elena released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. They were leaving for now, but something told her they'd be back with questions she wasn't prepared to answer and demands she wasn't willing to meet. Back in the barn, Storm was pawing at the ground, anxiously, his eyes fixed on her with an almost human concern. "They're gone," she assured him, reaching out to stroke his neck. "For now." But as the sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the weathered boards of the barn, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning, that in pulling Storm from the sea, she had set in motion events that would change both their lives irrevocably. She thought of the 4 glasses of whiskey waiting on her counter, silent monuments to the friends she couldn't save. Perhaps this time, with this strange, remarkable horse who seemed to need her as much as she needed purpose, the outcome would be different. Perhaps this time she could save someone who mattered. Krikonom. The hour crawled by with excruciating slowness. Elena used the time to prepare checking the security cameras she'd hastily installed around the property, cleaning her Beretta, and gathering supplies that might be needed if they had to leave quickly. Storm watched her movements with quiet intensity, as if understanding the gravity of the situation. He no longer pawed the ground in distress, but stood with a soldier's discipline, conserving energy, waiting for instructions. When Mason's rental car finally appeared on the security feed, Elena felt an unexpected surge of emotion relief mingled with apprehension. She hadn't seen him since they'd parted ways at Walter Reed Medical Center, both broken in body and spirit, their friendship fractured by the weight of survivor's guilt. She waited on the porch as he parked and stepped out of the car. Mason Taylor looked both exactly the same and completely different from the man she remembered. The same broad shoulders and military bearing, the same close-cropped dark hair and steady gaze. But there was a weariness to him now, a heaviness that hadn't been there before. "Elena?" he said, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps, giving her space. He remembered her boundaries at least. "Mason." She nodded stiffly. "You said you'd explain." "I will." His eyes scanned the property, noting the security cameras with approval. "The horse is it secure. He is in the barn," Elena corrected, emphasizing the pronoun. "And yes, he's secure." Mason nodded, some of the tension leaving his shoulders. "Can I see him?" Without waiting for an answer, he started toward the barn. Elena fell into step beside him, hyper-aware of his presence, of the careful distance he maintained between them. They had once been close, not romantically, but with the deep bond that forms between people who have faced death together. Now they moved like strangers, awkward and guarded. Inside the barn, Storm's reaction to Mason was immediate and surprising. The horse's ears pricked forward with recognition, and he moved toward the man with none of the caution he'd shown toward Elena initially. "Hello, old friend," Mason said softly, reaching out to touch Storm's muzzle. "Long time no see." Elena stared at him in shock. "You know him?" Mason nodded, his expression somber. "I know him. I know what he is, what they made him into." He turned to face Elena directly. "And now I need to tell you everything, because you're in more danger than you realize." As the afternoon sun slanted through the barn's dusty windows, Mason began to speak, unraveling a story so bizarre and terrifying that it would have seemed like fiction if not for the living proof standing before them, a horse with modified eyes and an implanted tracking device, a silent witness to experiments that crossed ethical boundaries and ventured into the realm of the unthinkable. And as Elena listened, the world she thought she understood began to shift beneath her feet, revealing darker depths and higher stakes than she could have imagined when she first spotted a drowning horse in a storm-tossed sea. The rescue had been only the beginning. Now came the reckoning. The barn had grown dim as Mason spoke, the afternoon light fading into the soft blues and purples of approaching evening. Elena sat on an overturned feed bucket, her face a carefully controlled mask that betrayed nothing of the storm raging within her. Only her hands, clenched white-knuckled in her lap, revealed her inner turmoil. Wild Light, Mason said, his voice low and steady, began as a defensive research initiative. The idea was simple but revolutionary: create biological sentinels that could detect threats before human senses could register them. "Sentinels," Elena repeated flatly. You mean weapons? Mason shook his head. Not initially. The project started as purely defensive animals with enhanced sensory capabilities that could warn of chemical attacks, locate IEDs, track hostiles through any terrain. He glanced at Storm, who stood attentively nearby, ears forward, as if following every word. Horses were ideal candidates, intelligent, trainable, with excellent natural senses that could be augmented. Augmented? Elena's voice was bitter. Is that what you call those burns around his eyes? The device in his neck? The ocular modifications allow him to see across multiple light spectrums, Mason explained. Infrared, ultraviolet, even certain electromagnetic frequencies. The implant is both a tracking device and a neural interface. It connects to the visual cortex, allowing handlers to see what he sees. Elena rose abruptly, pacing the small confines of the barn. Who authorized this? The military CIA. It started as a joint DoD-DARPA initiative, Mason said, fully authorized with ethical oversight committees and veterinary specialists. But about 3 years ago, the project was officially terminated. Budget cuts, they said. But it wasn't really terminated, Elena guessed, stopping to look at him directly. Mason met her gaze unflinchingly. No, it was privatized, transferred to a corporation called Wingate Industries. On paper, they're a security technology firm with government contracts. In reality, he trailed off, his expression darkening. In reality, they're developing applications that go far beyond the original defensive scope. Under their control, Wildlight evolved from a sentinel program into something else entirely. Storm shifted nervously, his tail swishing, as if the conversation itself disturbed him. Elena moved to his side, instinctively placing a calming hand on his neck. What did they do to him, Mason? Mason's eyes followed her movement, noting the easy connection between woman and horse. They selected 15 Mustangs with specific genetic markers, exceptional intelligence, natural stamina, unique physical attributes. Storm, or WL-42 as they designated him, was among the most successful subjects. His particular modifications make him ideal as a carrier. A carrier for what? Elena demanded, though part of her already suspected the answer. Biological agents, Mason said quietly. Specifically a new class of nanovaccines designed to disperse through air currents and provide widespread immunization against potential bioweapons. Elena stared at him in disbelief. You're telling me they turned horses into walking vaccination clinics without consent or oversight? The technology itself isn't malevolent, Mason insisted. Imagine being able to immunize an entire refugee camp against an outbreak without having to individually vaccinate thousands of people, or neutralizing a bioweapon attack before it can take effect. Then why the secrecy? Why the black SUVs watching my property? Mason's expression grew grim. Because somewhere along the way, the project director, Commander James Hayes, realized the same technology that could deliver vaccines could also deliver pathogens. The line between defensive and offensive applications blurred. A chill ran through Elena as the implications sank in. They weaponized it. Hayes has been selling the technology to private interests, Mason confirmed. Military contractors, foreign entities, anyone willing to pay. But he needs the original test subjects to complete the final phase of development. And one of those test subjects is currently standing in my barn. Elena concluded, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. Mason nodded, his eyes never leaving Storm. When they realized he'd escaped, they initiated recovery protocols immediately. The device in his neck allows them to track him, but it also serves another purpose: behavioral control. Mind control, Elena asked skeptically. Not exactly, but it can trigger conditioned responses, commands embedded during training. That's why he reacts so strongly to certain stimuli, like military aircraft. The sound activates specific neural pathways. Elena thought of Storm's panic the previous night, the way he'd pawed out SOS in Morse code. Not random behavior, but a deliberate cry for help from a being more aware than she had initially realized. How did he end up in the ocean? She asked. Mason's face tightened. There was a transport accident, or at least that's the official story. A barge carrying several test subjects from the coastal facility to a more secure inland location ran into a storm. Storm supposedly fell overboard. You don't believe it was an accident? I think he jumped, Mason said simply. I think he chose the sea over returning to the facility. Elena looked at Storm with new understanding. Not just an animal with unusual modifications, but a being capable of making a desperate choice for freedom, even at the risk of death. "And you," she asked, turning back to Mason, "where do you fit into all this?" A shadow crossed his face. "After we were discharged, I was recruited by Wingate. My background in military intelligence made me valuable. They didn't tell me the full scope of the project at first. By the time I understood what Hayes was doing, I was already compromised." "So you're working for them?" Elena's voice cooled noticeably. "No," Mason said firmly. "I'm working against them from the inside, gathering evidence documenting violations. When I have enough to bring down the entire operation without risk of it simply relocating and continuing under a new name, I'll take it to the proper authorities." Elena wanted to believe him, wanted to see the same honorable soldier she'd once trusted with her life. But years of isolation had heightened her natural skepticism. "Why should I trust you?" Mason didn't flinch from the question. "Because I could have told them exactly where to find Storm the moment you pulled him from the ocean. I didn't." Before Elena could respond, Storm suddenly tensed his head, jerking toward the small window that faced the driveway. A low warning whicker escaped him. Elena moved quickly to the window, peering out into the gathering dusk. The black SUV had returned this time, pulling directly into her driveway. Two men emerged, the same ones she'd observed earlier, now approaching her house with purposeful strides. "They're here," she said, stepping back from the window. Mason swore under his breath. "Sooner than I expected. They must have detected activity from his implant." "What do they want?" "To retrieve their property," Mason said grimly, "and eliminate any complications." The word hung in the air between them, complications. In this context, Elena had no doubt it meant her. "Options?" she asked, military training kicking in automatically. Mason assessed the situation with rapid efficiency. "They don't know I'm here yet. That gives us an advantage. If I confront them openly, claim I'm here on official Wingate business to secure the asset, it might buy us time. And if they don't buy it, then we move to Plan B." Mason reached behind his back, revealing a holstered pistol. "But I'd rather avoid that if possible. These guys are just following orders, probably don't even know what the project really involves." Elena nodded, her own hand moving to the Beretta at her waistband. "I'll stay with Storm. Keep him calm and quiet." As Mason headed for the door, Elena called after him. "Mason," he paused, looking back at her. "If this goes sideways, I need to know you're really on our side." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Our side," he repeated, glancing between her and Storm. "Already a team, huh?" Before she could respond, he was gone, slipping out the side door of the barn to circle around behind the approaching men. Alone with Storm, Elena moved to position herself protectively beside him. "It's going to be okay," she murmured, though she had no way of knowing if the promise was true. Outside, she heard Mason's voice, confident and authoritative, as he intercepted the visitors. "Gentlemen, can I help you?" There was a moment of tense silence, then a deeper voice responded. "Taylor, what are you doing here?" "Same as you, I imagine," Mason replied smoothly. "Asset recovery. Hayes sent me to assess the situation before we move in." "Funny," the second man said, skepticism evident in his tone. "Hayes didn't mention you were involved in this operation." "Need-to-know basis," Mason countered. "You know how compartmentalized these things are." Through the barn window, Elena could see the three men standing in her yard, a triangle of tension in the fading light. The two Wingate operatives, one tall and lean, the other shorter but powerfully built, had shifted to flank Mason, their body language predatory. "Why don't we all go inside?" Mason suggested, gesturing toward Elena's house. "I'll brief you on my findings so far." The taller man shook his head. "Our orders are to secure the asset first. The woman can be dealt with afterward." A chill ran down Elena's spine at the casual way he dismissed her as a problem to be dealt with. These men hadn't come for a friendly chat. "The asset isn't here," Mason said, his voice hardening slightly. "I've already checked the property. The woman knows nothing. She was out fishing yesterday, came back late. Whatever you tracked here, it's a ghost signal. Interference, maybe." The shorter man reached into his jacket, withdrawing a small device that resembled a smartphone. "That's not what our readings indicate. The implant is active and within 50 meters of this position." He turned slowly, the device extended before him like a divining rod. As he faced the barn, the device emitted a soft, pulsing beep. There, he said, pointing directly at Elena's hiding place. In the barn. Storm shifted nervously beside her, sensing the danger. Elena placed a steadying hand on his shoulder, her other hand drawing the Beretta. Outside, the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Listen, Mason said, stepping between the men in the barn. There's been a misunderstanding. I was sent ahead to prepare for extraction. We need to coordinate. Stand down, Taylor. The taller man ordered, his hand moving to his own concealed weapon. Your authorization codes don't check out. Hayes has no record of sending you here. Mason's posture changed subtly, weight shifting to the balls of his feet, hands relaxed but ready. Elena recognized the stance, a soldier preparing for combat. Last chance, Mason warned. Walk away. Report that it was a false signal. The shorter man laughed, a harsh sound in the quiet evening. And why would we do that? Because what's happening here is wrong, Mason said, his voice dropping to a fierce intensity. Because those horses aren't just test subjects, they're living beings that have been tortured and exploited. Because Hayes isn't developing defensive technology anymore. He's creating weapons that violate every international treaty on biological warfare. The taller man's expression remained unmoved. Save the ethics lecture for someone who cares, Taylor. We have our orders. He nodded to his partner. Check the barn. I'll deal with the turncoat. What happened next unfolded with the terrible clarity of combat. As the shorter man moved toward the barn, Mason made his move, a swift strike to the taller man's throat, followed by a sweeping kick that knocked him off balance. But these weren't ordinary security personnel. They were trained operatives, and they recovered quickly. The taller man rolled with the fall, coming up with his weapon drawn. Mason barely managed to knock it aside as the shot rang out, the bullet splintering wood somewhere to Elena's left. Storm reared in panic at the sound, his powerful hooves striking the barn wall. Elena gripped his halter, trying to steady him while keeping her weapon trained on the door. Easy, she whispered. Easy, boy. Outside, the fight continued, grunts of exertion, the dull thud of blows connecting with flesh. Elena couldn't see what was happening, but she could hear Mason's ragged breathing, the sound of a body hitting the ground hard. The barn door creaked open, and the shorter operative stepped inside, his gun drawn, his face tight with concentration. He scanned the dim interior, eyes adjusting to the shadows. Come out now, he called. Hands where I can see them. Elena remained hidden behind Storm's bulk, her heart hammering against her ribs. She could shoot the man, had the skill and the angle to make it a clean kill. But something held her back. Mason's words echoed in her mind. These guys are just following orders, probably don't even know what the project really involves. Taking a life wasn't a decision to make lightly, not even in self-defense. I know you're in here, the man continued, moving deeper into the barn. We're not here to hurt you. We just need to recover government property. He's not property, Elena called, keeping her position concealed. He's a living being. The man stopped, his weapon tracking toward the sound of her voice. The horse belongs to a classified research program. Interfering with federal assets is a serious offense. So is performing illegal experiments, Elena countered. Weaponizing animals. Violating the Biological Weapons Convention. A flicker of uncertainty crossed the man's face. I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just here to recover a missing test subject. Do you even know what they've done to him? Elena demanded. Well, what they're planning to use him for. Before the man could respond, a commotion outside drew his attention. The momentary distraction was all Elena needed. She stepped out from behind Storm, her Beretta aimed steadily at the operative's chest. Drop it, she ordered, her voice calm and authoritative. Slowly. The man froze, assessing his options. For a tense moment, Elena thought he might try to shoot anyway. Then, with deliberate care, he lowered his weapon to the ground. Kick it away, she instructed. He complied, sending the gun skittering across the barn floor. Now hands on your head and kneel. As the man followed her instructions, the barn door burst open again. Elena swung her weapon toward the new threat finger, tightening on the trigger. Elena, don't shoot, Mason's voice. He stood in the doorway, bloodied but upright, the taller operative unconscious at his feet. I've got him. Relief flooded through her, but she kept her weapon trained on the kneeling man. Are there more coming? Mason shook his head, wincing slightly from what looked like a nasty cut above his eye. Not immediately, but we need to move quickly. They're required to check in every 30 minutes. When they miss their next call, backup will be dispatched. What's the plan? Elena asked, already running through possibilities in her mind. We need to get Storm somewhere safe, somewhere they can't track him. Mason knelt beside the unconscious operative, efficiently removing zip ties from the man's tactical vest and using them to bind his wrists. And we need to disable that implant. Elena turned her attention to the kneeling man. You? What's your name? After a moment's hesitation, he replied, Daniels. Okay, Daniels, here's what's going to happen. We're going to restrain you, and then we're going to leave. When your backup arrives, you'll tell them exactly what happened, that you were overpowered while attempting to recover the test subject. They'll hunt you down, Daniels warned. Wingate has resources you can't imagine. Maybe, Elena conceded, but by then we'll have evidence of what they've really been doing, evidence that will interest a lot of people in Washington. As Mason secured Daniels beside his unconscious partner, Elena turned her attention to Storm. The horse was agitated but under control, watching the proceedings with those unnervingly intelligent eyes. We need to move, she told him, as if he could understand every word. These people want to take you back to that place. I won't let that happen. Storm's ears pricked forward, and he nickered softly, a sound that Elena chose to interpret as agreement. Where can we go? She asked Mason as he finished restraining the operatives. I have a contact in town, Sophia Reeves. She's a journalist who's been investigating Wingate for months. She has a place outside Point Haven where we can lie low while we figure out our next move. Elena raised an eyebrow. A journalist? That seems risky. She's trustworthy, Mason assured her, and she has resources. We need secure communications contacts in federal oversight agencies. Elena hesitated, weighing their limited options. All right, she said finally. But first I need to talk to Howard. He might be able to help with the implant. Mason checked his watch. We have about 20 minutes before these guys miss their check-in. Can you be ready to move by then? Elena nodded, already mentally cataloging what she would need. I'll get some supplies from the house. You prep Storm for transport. As she headed for the door, Mason called after her. Elena. She paused, looking back at him. Thank you for trusting me. She studied him for a moment, the former squad mate who had shared the worst day of her life, now bloodied from fighting to protect her and a horse he barely knew. Don't make me regret it, she said simply, and disappeared into the gathering darkness. Everyone's run. Howard Mackenzie's small house sat on the edge of Point Haven, its weathered blue siding and white trim, a familiar landmark for local fishermen returning to harbor. Despite the late-hour lights still burned in the windows, Howard had always been a night owl, a habit formed during his years as a combat medic in Vietnam. Elena parked her truck a block away, not wanting to draw attention to his home, in case Wingate had people watching the town. The horse trailer she'd hitched to the back held Storm and Mason, the latter keeping the horse calm during the tense journey from Elena's property. She approached Howard's back door, staying in the shadows, hyper-aware of every sound in the quiet neighborhood. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A television murmured behind closed curtains. Normal, peaceful evening sounds that now seemed fraught with potential danger. Howard answered her soft knock immediately, as if he'd been waiting for her. His weathered face registered no surprise at her appearance, only a quiet concern. Figured you might show up, he said, stepping back to let her in. Saw a couple of government types asking questions at Martha's Cafe earlier. They seemed particularly interested in anyone who might have rescued a horse from the ocean. Elena slipped inside, grateful for the warmth and security of Howard's kitchen. I need your help, she said without preamble. Howard nodded as if he'd expected nothing less. The horse? Yes, but it's complicated. Most things worth doing are. Howard gestured for her to sit at his kitchen table. Tell me. As concisely as possible, Elena explained what she learned from Mason, the Wildlight Project, Storm's modifications, the implant that allowed Wingate to track and potentially control him. Howard listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly grave. When she finished, he remained silent for a long moment, fingers drumming thoughtfully on the tabletop. I've seen some things in my time, he said finally. Things the military would rather keep buried. But this, he shook his head, this crosses lines I didn't think even the most classified projects would dare to cross. Can you help? Elena asked. Mason says we need to disable the implant, but removing it surgically might be too risky without proper equipment. Howard rose from the table, moving to a cabinet above his refrigerator. From it, he withdrew a worn leather case that looked like it belonged in a museum. Vietnam taught me to be creative with medical solutions, he said, opening the case to reveal an assortment of instruments and vials. Sometimes the best approach isn't the most obvious one. He selected a small amber bottle, holding it up to the light. Electromagnetic pulse generator, miniaturized version, developed for field operations where enemy tech needed to be disabled without collateral damage. Elena stared at him in surprise. You have military-grade EMP technology in your kitchen cabinet. A ghost of a smile touched Howard's lips. I didn't exactly turn in all my equipment when I was discharged. Some things seem too useful to leave behind. Will it work on the implant? It should disable the tracking and transmission functions without harming the surrounding tissue, Howard said. But I can't guarantee it won't affect the neural interface components. There might be side effects. Elena considered this. What kind of side effects? Hard to say without knowing exactly how the implant is integrated with the horse's nervous system. Could range from harmless sensory disruption to more serious neurological issues. So we're gambling, Elena said. Howard nodded solemnly. Medicine often is, but from what you've told me, the alternative is worse. Elena couldn't argue with that. If they did nothing, Wingate would recapture Storm and continue their dangerous work. Whatever risks the EMP posed, they paled in comparison to the certainty of returning to captivity. There's something else. Howard said, his voice taking on a different quality, hesitant, almost vulnerable. Something I need to tell you before we proceed. Elena looked at him expectantly. I wasn't always just a hardware store owner. Howard began, his eyes fixed on some distant point. Before Vietnam, I was part of a research division at Walter Reed's Special Projects, biological countermeasures, things that never made the official reports. A cold feeling settled in Elena's stomach. What are you saying? I'm saying I've seen this kind of work before, Howard said quietly. Different era, different methods, but the same basic premise, using biological systems to deliver targeted compounds. You were part of it, Elena asked, trying to reconcile this new information with the Howard she thought she knew. At first, he admitted, I believed in the mission protecting our troops from chemical and biological threats. But when I realized how easily defensive measures could be repurposed as offensive weapons, I got out. Requested a transfer to a MASH unit in Vietnam. His mouth twisted in a grim smile. Seemed safer than staying in that lab. Elena absorbed this revelation, understanding now why Howard had always seemed to know exactly what to say when her own military experiences haunted her. He'd carried his own burdens, his own regrets. Why are you telling me this now? Because you need to understand what you're up against, Howard said, meeting her gaze directly. These people, the ones behind Wildlight, they won't stop. They've invested too much, crossed too many lines to turn back now. And they're protected by layers of classification and deniability that make them virtually untouchable through normal channels. Then what do we do? Elena asked, frustration edging into her voice. You expose them, Howard said simply. Not just to government oversight committees that can be influenced or sidelined, but to the public. Make it impossible for them to continue operating in the shadows. Elena thought of Mason's plan, his careful gathering of evidence. That's dangerous. Yes, Howard agreed, but so is letting them continue. He rose from the table, tucking the EMP generator into his pocket. Now let's see about this horse of yours. Outside, the night had deepened, stars emerging in a clear, cold sky. Elena led Howard to where she'd parked the trailer, keeping to the shadows and checking constantly for any sign of surveillance. Mason opened the trailer door, cautiously, relief evident on his face when he recognized Howard. Sir, he said, with the automatic respect of a younger soldier for an elder. Thank you for helping us. Howard nodded briefly. Let's see what we're dealing with. Storm stood calmly in the trailer, seemingly unfazed by the cramped quarters. His dark eyes regarded Howard with the same intelligent assessment he'd shown Elena from the beginning. Remarkable, Howard murmured, approaching slowly with his hand extended, palm up. May I? Storm lowered his head slightly, allowing Howard to touch him. The older man's fingers moved gently along the horse's neck, locating the implant with practiced ease. Sophisticated work, he observed. The integration with surrounding tissue is nearly seamless. He glanced at Elena. This wasn't done by amateurs. Can you disable it? Mason asked, tension evident in his voice. Howard withdrew the small amber bottle from his pocket. This EMP should fry the circuitry without causing physical harm. But I need to warn you, this is experimental. There's no way to predict exactly how it will affect him. Do we have a choice? Elena asked. There's always a choice, Howard replied. But sometimes none of the options are good ones. After a moment's silent deliberation, Elena nodded. Do it. Howard uncapped the bottle, revealing what looked like a small metal stylus. I'll need to place this directly over the implant. Someone should hold him steady. This might be unpleasant. Elena moved to Storm's head, taking hold of his halter and speaking soothingly to him. It's okay. We're trying to help you. Just stay still for a moment. Whether he understood her words or simply trusted her presence, Storm remained perfectly still as Howard positioned the EMP generator against his neck. Ready? Howard asked. Elena nodded, her free hand stroking Storm's forehead. Howard pressed a button on the device. There was no sound, no visible effect, but Storm's reaction was immediate and alarming. His entire body went rigid, his eyes rolling back to show the whites. A strange keening sound escaped him, a noise no horse should be capable of making. For a terrible moment, Elena thought they'd killed him. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the seizure passed. Storm's legs buckled and he would have collapsed if not for the confined space of the trailer. Storm! Elena cried, abandoning protocol and wrapping her arms around his neck to support him. Howard, what happened? The older man's face was grim. The implant must have been more deeply integrated with his nervous system than I anticipated. The EMP caused a temporary neural disruption. Is he okay? Mason demanded, moving to help Elena support the horse's weight. Howard checked Storm's eyes, his pulse, his breathing. Vital signs are stabilizing. I think he'll recover, but we should monitor him closely. As if to confirm this assessment, Storm began to regain his footing, his breathing evening out. But when he opened his eyes, Elena noticed something different, a subtle change in their depth and focus, as if something essential had been altered. Storm, she said softly, placing a hand on his muzzle. Can you understand me? The horse nickered softly, bumping his nose against her palm. The connection was still there, but Elena sensed a difference, as if a veil had been lifted between them, allowing for clearer communication. The implant, Howard said, examining Storm's neck. It's no longer active. The indicator lights are dark. So they can't track him anymore? Mason asked. Not through the implant, Howard confirmed. But that doesn't mean they won't find other ways to look for him. Wingate has resources beyond normal government channels. Elena felt a wave of relief tempered by the knowledge that they were still far from safe. We need to keep moving, she said. The operatives we left at my place will have been discovered by now. Howard nodded. There's an old logging road that runs behind my property, connects to Highway 101, about 5 miles south of town. Less chance of being spotted that way. What about you? Elena asked, suddenly concerned for the older man's safety. If they figure out you helped us. I can take care of myself, Howard assured her. Besides, I'm just a harmless old hardware store owner. What would I know about classified military projects? The twinkle in his eye didn't entirely mask the determination beneath, and Elena was reminded again that there was more to Howard Mackenzie than met the eye. Thank you, she said simply, knowing the words were inadequate for the risk he was taking. Howard's expression softened. You've been hiding from the world since you came back, Elena. Maybe this is your chance to rejoin it, to make a difference again. Before she could respond, Mason's urgent voice called from outside the trailer. We've got company. Black SUV just turned onto the street. Elena's heart sank. How did they find us so quickly? The operatives must have gotten free, reported your vehicle description, Mason said, already moving to the driver's side of Elena's truck. We need to go. Now. Howard pressed something into Elena's hand, a small USB drive. Evidence, he explained quickly, from my days at Walter Reed, might help make your case against Wingate. Elena stared at him in surprise. You kept records. Insurance, Howard said grimly, in case the past ever came back to haunt me, which it seems it has. She pocketed the drive, then on impulse embraced the older man briefly. Be careful. Howard smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through his usual reserve. You too, soldier, and take care of that remarkable horse. As Elena climbed into the passenger seat of her truck, she saw Howard already retreating into the shadows, making his way back to his house by a circuitous route that would avoid the approaching SUV. Mason started the engine, keeping the headlights off as they pulled away from the curb. "The logging road," he said. "Where exactly?" Elena directed him through the darkened streets of Point Haven, every sense alert for signs of pursuit. In the trailer behind them, Storm moved with surprising steadiness, seemingly recovered from the effects of the EMP. They had just reached the outskirts of town when Elena's phone rang, Howard's number flashing on the screen. "They're on to you," Howard said without preamble, his voice tight with urgency. "They've set up a checkpoint on the main road out of town. 2 vehicles, armed personnel." "What about the logging road?" Elena asked. "Should still be clear, but they're moving fast. You need to get off the grid completely, no phones, no credit cards, nothing they can track." "What about you? Are you safe?" There was a brief pause. "Don't worry about me. Just go." "And Elena?" Another pause, longer this time. "I believe in what you're doing. Never forget that." The call ended abruptly, leaving Elena with a gnawing sense of unease. Howard was holding something back. Something important. "Problem?" Mason asked, noting her expression. "Checkpoint ahead," she reported, pushing her personal concerns aside. "We need to find that logging road now." Mason nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Give me directions. I'll get us through." As they veered off the main street onto a narrow, unpaved track that would lead them to the logging road, Elena glanced back at the trailer where Storm stood silently, his dark eyes reflecting the faint starlight. His future, perhaps all their futures, now depended on their ability to stay ahead of Wingate's pursuit and find a way to expose the truth about Project Wildlight. The night enfolded them a temporary sanctuary as they drove deeper into the forest, leaving Point Haven and its small comforts behind. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and the faint hope that they could make right what had gone so terribly wrong. The logging road was exactly as Howard had described: narrow, poorly maintained, and practically invisible unless you knew where to look. Mason navigated it with careful precision, the truck's headlights cutting through the dense forest like twin blades. Elena kept watch behind them, alert for any sign of pursuit. So far, they seemed to have escaped detection, but she knew better than to relax her vigilance. Wingate had resources and determination. They wouldn't give up easily. "How much farther to this journalist's place?" she asked, checking her watch. It was just past midnight, the forest around them a symphony of nocturnal sounds, owls calling, small creatures rustling in the underbrush. "About 20 miles, Mason replied, his eyes never leaving the treacherous road. "There's an old fire lookout tower she converted into a cabin. Isolated, defensible, with good sight lines in all directions." "Sounds like you've been there before." Mason nodded, a faint smile touching his lips. "Sophia and I have history." Elena raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. Mason's personal life wasn't her concern. What mattered was whether this Sophia Reeves could be trusted with their lives and with Storm's freedom. "Tell me about her," she said instead. "How did a journalist get involved in this?" Mason navigated around a particularly deep pothole before answering. "Sophia started investigating Wingate about a year ago, after she noticed unusual patterns in their government contracts. She has sources inside various oversight agencies, people who've been concerned about the company's practices but lack the evidence to act officially. And she believes this Wildlight story about horses with modified eyes and biological agents. She's seen enough to know something extraordinary is happening," Mason said, "but hard evidence has been difficult to come by. That's where Storm comes in. He's the proof she needs to break the story wide open." Elena frowned, uncomfortable with the implication. "Storm isn't evidence to be paraded in front of cameras. He's a living being who's already suffered enough." "I know that," Mason assured her quickly. "So does Sophia. She's not looking to exploit him. She wants to help him, and all the others like him." Before Elena could respond, a noise from the trailer caught her attention, Storm pawing at the floor in what sounded like distress. She twisted in her seat, trying to see through the small window into the trailer. "Something's wrong," she said, concern sharpening her voice. "Pull over." Mason complied immediately, bringing the truck to a stop on a wider section of the road. Elena was out of the vehicle before it had fully settled, moving quickly to the trailer doors. Inside, Storm was clearly agitated, his head tossing, ears pinned back against his skull. Sweat darkened his coat despite the cool night air. "Hey," Elena said softly, entering the trailer and approaching him with caution. "What's wrong, boy?" As she drew closer, she noticed something alarming, a faint pulsing glow beneath the skin where the implant was embedded. The device Howard had supposedly disabled was showing signs of activity. "Mason," she called, her voice tight with urgency. "Get in here." He appeared at the trailer door, taking in the situation with a soldier's rapid assessment. "The implant, it's reactivating somehow." "How is that possible? Howard's EMP should have fried the circuitry completely." Mason moved closer, examining the glowing device with a frown. "These implants have backup systems, fail-safes designed to prevent exactly what we tried to do. The primary circuits are fried, but the secondary systems are coming online." Storm's distress was increasing, his breathing rapid and shallow eyes wild with fear or pain. Elena couldn't tell which. "Can we remove it?" she asked, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. Mason shook his head. "Not here, not without proper medical equipment. The implant has integrated with his nervous system. A botched removal could cause permanent damage." "We can't just leave it," Elena insisted. "If it's reactivating, they can track us. And what if it's hurting him?" She placed a gentle hand on Storm's neck, feeling the heat radiating from his skin. The horse leaned into her touch, a gesture of trust that tightened something in her chest. "Wait," Mason said, his expression changing as he studied the implant more closely. "This isn't a normal reactivation sequence. The pattern of the pulses is different." "Different how?" "It's not transmitting coordinates," Mason explained. "It's cycling through diagnostic protocols, like it's trying to repair itself but can't quite manage it." Elena considered this. "So they can't track us through it?" "Not yet," Mason said. "But that could change if the self-repair functions succeed." A thought occurred to Elena. Howard said the EMP might affect the neural interface components. Could that be what we're seeing? The implant trying to re-establish its connection with Storm's nervous system? Mason nodded slowly. "That's possible. The interface is designed to be self-maintaining, adapting to changes in the host biology. And if it succeeds, what happens to Storm?" "Hard to say," Mason admitted. "The neural interface is what allows the handlers to see what he sees, to monitor his vital signs, potentially to influence his behavior. If it reestablishes completely, they could theoretically assert control remotely." The implications were chilling. Elena remembered Storm's panic at the sound of military aircraft, a conditioned response triggered by external stimuli. What other commands might be embedded in his training, waiting to be activated? "How do we stop it?" she demanded. Mason ran a hand through his hair, thinking rapidly. "Sophia might have ideas. She's been researching Wingate's technology for months." "We can't wait that long," Elena insisted. "Look at him, he's suffering now." Storm's condition was indeed deteriorating. His legs trembled with strain, and foam flecked the corners of his mouth. Whatever the implant was doing, it was causing him significant distress. Elena made a decision. "We need to try again, a stronger EMP or some way to physically disable the device without removing it completely." "We don't have the equipment," Mason pointed out. "No, but I bet I know someone who does." Elena pulled out her phone, then hesitated. "If the implant is trying to transmit, using this could give away our position." Mason nodded grimly. "It's a risk either way. Make the call, but keep it brief." Elena dialed Howard's number, her heart pounding as she waited through 4 rings. When he finally answered, his voice was strained, barely audible. "Elena, not a good time. Howard, the implant is reactivating. Storm is in distress. We need help." There was a pause filled with what sounded like muffled conversation in the background. Then Howard's voice returned, even quieter than before. "Can't talk freely. They're here." Elena's blood ran cold. "Wingate." "Yes." Another pause. "Listen carefully. The fail-safe protocols can be manually overridden. Strong magnetic field reverse polarity applied directly to the auxiliary port." "Auxiliary port," Elena repeated, confusion evident in her voice. "Small depression on the underside of the implant," Howard explained hurriedly. "Barely visible. Designed for emergency access." His voice dropped even lower. "Elena, they know about the logging road. They're sending—" The call cut off abruptly, leaving Elena staring at her phone in alarm. What happened? Mason asked, tension evident in his voice. Wingate is at Howard's place, Elena reported grimly. And they know about the logging road. We need to move now. But first they had to deal with the implant. Elena relayed Howard's instructions about the auxiliary port and the magnetic field. Reversed polarity, Mason mused. We need a strong magnet with a specific orientation. Elena's eyes fell on the truck's sound system, an aftermarket unit her father had installed years ago, with powerful speakers mounted in the rear cab wall. The speaker magnets, she said, already moving toward the truck. If we remove one and apply it correctly, Mason caught on immediately. It might work. The magnetic field from a good-sized speaker could be strong enough to disrupt the fail-safe protocols. Working quickly, they dismantled the rear speaker from Elena's truck. The magnet inside was substantial, a heavy black disc about the size of a hockey puck. Back in the trailer, Storm's condition had worsened. He stood with his head hanging low, legs braced wide as if he might collapse at any moment. Hold him steady, Mason instructed, manipulating the speaker magnet to orient it correctly. This might trigger another seizure. Elena positioned herself at Storm's head, speaking softly to him as she maintained a firm grip on his halter. It's going to be okay. We're going to fix this. With careful precision, Mason located the tiny depression Howard had described, a small port on the underside of the implant, almost invisible beneath the horse's dark coat. He pressed the magnet against it, maintaining steady pressure. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then, with a faint electronic whine, the pulsing glow from the implant flickered and died. Storm's reaction was less violent this time, a full-body shudder followed by a deep, shaky breath. His legs steadied, and the wild look in his eyes gradually faded. I think it worked, Mason said cautiously, removing the magnet. The activity has stopped. Elena ran her hand along Storm's neck, feeling the implant site. The device was cool to the touch, now inert. We need to make sure it stays that way, she said. Some kind of shielding, maybe. Mason nodded. The magnet itself might work as a temporary measure. If we secure it over the implant, it could prevent reactivation. Using medical tape from Elena's first aid kit, they carefully attached the speaker magnet over the implant, positioning it to maintain the proper polarity. It wasn't elegant, but it seemed to work. Storm's distress eased noticeably once the magnet was in place. We need to get moving, Mason said, checking his watch. If they know about the logging road, they'll have people on it soon. Elena nodded, giving Storm one last reassuring pat before exiting the trailer. Options. Mason studied the forest around them, thinking. There's an old fire break about a mile ahead. If we take that, we can cut across to a different access road that leads to Sophia's place. It'll be rough going with the trailer, but it might throw them off our trail. Do it, Elena said, climbing back into the passenger seat. And step on it. I want to be far away from here when they come looking. As they drove deeper into the forest, following the narrow, winding logging road, Elena couldn't shake the image of Howard trapped in his own home with Wingate operatives. Had he sacrificed himself to buy them time? What had he been trying to tell her when the call cut off? Storm's soft nickering from the trailer interrupted her troubled thoughts. Despite everything, the pain, the fear, the uncertainty, he was still fighting, still trusting them to lead him to safety. Elena squared her shoulders, pushing aside her fatigue and doubt. They had come too far to fail now. Whatever lay ahead, whatever challenges awaited them at Sophia Reeve's remote cabin, she would face them with the same determination that had carried her through war and its aftermath. For Storm, for Howard, and perhaps finally for herself. Dawn was breaking over the coastal mountains when they finally reached Sophia Reeve's property, a remote 5-acre parcel dominated by a converted fire lookout tower that rose above the surrounding forest like a sentinel from another era. The tower itself had been modernized with large window solar panels and a wraparound deck that offered 360-degree views of the rugged landscape. Mason parked the truck at the base of the tower, cutting the engine with a sigh of relief. Made it, he said, the exhaustion evident in his voice. They had been driving for hours, taking increasingly obscure forest roads to avoid potential pursuit. Elena stepped out of the truck, stretching her stiff muscles and surveying their surroundings with a tactical eye. The location was naturally defensible high ground, good visibility, limited approaches. If they had to make a stand, they could do worse than this isolated tower. The door at the base of the structure swung open, and a woman emerged, tall, lean, with short auburn hair and sharp, assessing eyes. She moved with the confident grace of someone comfortable in her own skin, her gaze sweeping over Elena, the truck and the horse trailer with quick intelligence. "You must be Elena," she said, extending a hand. "Sophia Reeves. Mason's told me about you." Elena accepted the handshake, noting the firm grip and the calluses that suggested Sophia was no stranger to physical work. "Nice place," she said, nodding toward the tower. A smile touched Sophia's lips. "Isolated, defensible, off-grid. Perfect for a journalist who tends to make powerful enemies." Her gaze shifted to the trailer. "Is that him the horse Mason mentioned?" "His name is Storm," Elena said, a note of protectiveness entering her voice. "And he's been through hell." Something in Sophia's expression softened. "Then let's get him somewhere safe and comfortable." "Ainum," she gestured toward a small barn nestled among the trees. "I keep a couple of rescue horses myself. There's plenty of room for one more." As they worked to settle Storm in the barn, Elena observed the easy way Sophia moved around the animals, the gentle confidence in her handling. Whatever else she might be, this woman understood horses. Storm seemed to sense it too, accepting Sophia's presence with surprising ease. He still stayed closest to Elena, but he didn't show the wariness he had exhibited with Liam and other strangers. "The implant," Sophia said, examining the makeshift magnet setup with professional curiosity. Mason explained about it on the phone. "I've been researching Wingate's neural interface technology for months, but this is the first time I've seen an actual device." "Can you help us disable it permanently?" Elena asked. "The magnet seems to be working for now, but it's hardly a long-term solution." Sophia nodded thoughtfully. "I have some equipment in the tower that might help. Electromagnetic shielding signal jammers, tools of the trade when you're investigating companies that don't want to be investigated." Once Storm was settled with fresh water and hay, they made their way up the spiral staircase to Sophia's living quarters. The main room of the tower was a remarkable space-part high-tech, office-part cozy home. Banks of computer equipment shared space with comfortable furniture and bookshelves crammed with volumes on diverse subjects. "Impressive setup," Elena commented, taking in the multiple monitors and sophisticated communications equipment. "Necessary for what I do," Sophia replied, moving to a coffee maker that occupied a small kitchenette in one corner. "I assume you both could use some caffeine." Neither Elena nor Mason declined the offer. As Sophia prepared the coffee, Elena found herself drawn to the wall of evidence the journalist had assembled: photographs, documents, timelines, all connected with strings in a complex web of information. At the center was the Wingate logo, surrounded by satellite images of facilities, personnel profiles, and financial records. "How long have you been tracking them?" Elena asked, studying a photograph of what appeared to be a secure compound nestled in a remote valley. "Almost a year," Sophia answered, handing her a steaming mug. "Ever since a source at the Pentagon tipped me off about unusual appropriations for a supposedly terminated DARPA project." Mason joined them at the evidence wall, his expression grim as he surveyed the accumulated information. "You've been busy," he observed. "When you're chasing a story like this, you can't afford to miss anything," Sophia said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Wingate has connections in every branch of government private security contracts worth billions, and a corporate structure so convoluted it takes specialized software just to map the subsidiaries." She tapped a document pinned to the wall, a complex organizational chart that resembled a spider's web more than a corporate hierarchy. "The man at the center of it all is Commander James Hayes," she continued. "Former Navy Special Operations background, recruited to DARPA 15 years ago to oversee biological countermeasures research. When the Wildlight Project was officially terminated, he arranged for Wingate to acquire the intellectual property and continue the work privately. With government funding," Mason added, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Black budget allocations," Sophia confirmed, "routed through a maze of shell companies and classified programs. Nearly impossible to track unless you know exactly what you're looking for." Elena studied a photograph of Hayes, a middle-aged man with close-cropped gray hair and the hard eyes of someone accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. There was something coldly analytical in his gaze that sent a chill down her spine. "What's his endgame?" she asked. "Mason mentioned selling the technology to private interests, but there must be more to it than that." Sophia's expression grew somber. According to my sources, Hayes is developing what he calls a comprehensive biological defense initiative, a network of modified animals deployed across strategic locations, carrying vaccines that can be activated remotely in response to detected threats. That doesn't sound entirely nefarious, Elena pointed out, if it's genuinely defensive. The problem, Mason interjected, is that the same delivery system that can distribute vaccines can also distribute pathogens. It's a dual-use technology with catastrophic potential for misuse. And Hayes has already begun marketing it to certain interested parties, Sophia added grimly. Foreign military organizations, private security firms, even non-state actors with the resources to pay his price. Elena felt a cold weight settling in her stomach as the full implications became clear. Storm wasn't just an experimental subject. He was potentially a delivery system for biological agents that could affect thousands, perhaps millions of people. So what's the plan? She asked, turning to face both Mason and Sophia. We have Storm. We have evidence of the implant. What's our next move? Sophia set her coffee mug down, her expression resolute. We need to compile everything, your testimony, documentation of Storm's modifications, financial records showing the money trail, and testimony from someone inside the project who can verify the dual-use applications. Like Mason, Elena said, glancing at her former squad mate. Mason nodded. I've been gathering evidence for months, internal memos, research protocols, meeting recordings. But we need more. Something irrefutable that proves Hayes is selling weapons technology, not just defensive systems. What about Howard? Elena asked, remembering the USB drive he had given her. He seemed to know more about this than he initially let on. A shadow crossed Mason's face. Howard Mackenzie isn't just a hardware store owner, is he? No, Elena admitted, withdrawing the drive from her pocket. He said he worked at Walter Reed before Vietnam's Special Projects Biological Countermeasures. He gave me this before we left. Sophia took the drive, examining it with professional interest. This could be valuable. Let's see what he thought was important enough to preserve all these years. As she moved to insert the drive into her computer, a sound from outside froze them all in place, the distinctive rhythm of helicopter rotors growing rapidly louder. Expecting visitors? Elena asked, already moving toward the window. Sophia shook her head, her expression grim. No one knows about this place except a few trusted contacts. The helicopter came into view, a sleek black craft with no identifying markings circling the tower at a distance. It made no attempt to land, simply maintaining its position as if conducting surveillance. No normal flight path comes near here, Sophia said, grabbing a pair of binoculars from her desk. This is deliberate. She focused on the craft, her face tightening. Wingate security markings on the underside. They found us. How? Mason demanded, joining her at the window. The implant, Elena suggested, though she had been certain the magnet had disabled it completely. Maybe, Mason acknowledged. Or they could have tracked Howard's call to your phone, or followed our trail through the forest. They have resources we can only guess at. The helicopter continued its lazy circle like a predator assessing its prey before striking. We need to move, Elena said, military training kicking in automatically. They're calling for backup, establishing a perimeter. Standard containment protocol. Sophia was already in motion, moving to a secure cabinet and withdrawing several hard drives in a waterproof case. Everything important is backed up and encrypted, she said, packing the items efficiently. But we need to take the physical evidence with us. What about Storm? Elena asked, her thoughts immediately going to the horse in the barn below. There's an old mining road that runs behind the property, Sophia said, continuing her rapid packing. Barely visible unless you know where to look. It connects to a network of trails that the Forest Service uses for maintenance. If we can reach those trails, we might be able to lose them in the National Forest. The sound of the helicopter was joined by another noise, the rumble of vehicles approaching on the access road. Time's up, Mason said grimly. They're here. Elena moved to the weapons cabinet she had noticed earlier, selecting a shotgun and checking its action with practiced ease. I'll get Storm ready. You two grab whatever evidence we can't afford to lose. As she headed for the stairs, Mason caught her arm. Elena. His eyes met hers, concern evident in his gaze. Be careful. She nodded once, acknowledging the warning without words. Then she was moving, descending the spiral staircase, 3 steps at a time, her mind already plotting escape routes and defensive positions. Outside, the morning sun had fully risen, casting long shadows across the clearing around the tower. The helicopter maintained its position overhead, while the sound of approaching vehicles grew louder by the second. Elena sprinted to the barn, finding Storm already alert and agitated, sensing the danger even from within the wooden structure. The other horses in the adjacent stalls nickered nervously, picking up on his tension. "Time to go, boy," she murmured quickly, preparing him for travel. There was no time for the trailer. They would have to ride. Fortunately, Sophia had basic tack hanging nearby. As Elena worked, her thoughts raced ahead to what awaited them. Wingate had found them once. They would find them again. This wasn't just about escaping the immediate threat. They needed a permanent solution, a way to expose Wildlight so thoroughly that even Hayes's government connections couldn't protect him. Storm stood steady as she tightened the saddle girth, his dark eyes watching her with that uncanny intelligence. Despite everything, the implant, the pursuit, the danger, he trusted her. That trust was a responsibility Elena felt deeply, a weight and a privilege. "We're going to fix this," she promised him, her hand resting briefly on his powerful neck. "We're going to make it right." As if in response, Storm lowered his head slightly, pressing his forehead against her shoulder in a gesture that felt remarkably like solidarity. Outside, the first vehicles were arriving, the distinctive sound of SUVs coming to a stop, doors, opening orders being called out in clipped professional tones. Wingate's recovery team coming to reclaim their property and eliminate the complications. Elena checked the shotgun, ensuring it was loaded and ready. She had no desire to harm anyone, but she would not allow them to take Storm. Not now. Not after everything they had been through. Through the barn door, she could see Mason and Sophia emerging from the tower, moving quickly toward a rugged Jeep, parked on the far side of the clearing. They had made it halfway when the first Wingate operatives appeared at the edge of the property, black-clad figures moving with military precision, weapons drawn. A voice called out through a bullhorn, the words echoing across the clearing. "This is Commander Hayes of Wingate Security. You are in possession of classified government property. Surrender immediately and you will not be harmed." Elena's blood ran cold at the realization that Hayes himself was leading the recovery operation. This wasn't just about retrieving Storm, it was about silencing everyone who knew the truth about Wildlight. Mason and Sophia had reached the Jeep, ducking behind it as the Wingate team advanced. Elena knew she had seconds to decide: try to reach them or take Storm and escape through the forest while the others created a diversion. The decision was made for her when one of the operatives spotted her at the barn entrance. He raised his weapon, shouting something to his colleagues. Elena swung onto Storm's back, grateful for the years of riding lessons her father had insisted upon in her youth. "Go," she whispered urgently, guiding him toward the tree line behind the barn. Storm responded instantly, lunging forward with powerful strides that ate up the ground between the barn and the forest. Behind them, shouts of alarm rose from the Wingate team, followed by the crack of gunfire. Elena ducked low over Storm's neck, feeling the wind of a bullet pass too close for comfort. Then they were among the trees, the dense forest swallowing them as Storm navigated the uneven ground with surprising sureness. The sounds of the confrontation at the tower faded behind them, replaced by the rhythm of hoofbeats and the rush of their combined breathing. Elena glanced back, once hoping Mason and Sophia had managed to escape as well. Ahead lay unknown territory, dangers she could only imagine, and a desperate race against an enemy with seemingly limitless resources. But for the first time since that fateful day in Afghanistan, Elena felt something long dormant stirring within her, a sense of purpose, of righteous anger, of determination to protect what mattered. She and Storm were no longer just survivors of separate traumas. They were partners, now bound by shared danger and mutual trust. Whatever came next, they would face it together. The forest embraced them, offering temporary sanctuary as they pushed deeper into its shadowed heart, leaving behind the life Elena had built for herself in Point Haven. There was no going back now, only forward toward an uncertain future and the faint hope of justice. Storm ran steadily beneath her, his powerful muscles working in perfect harmony each stride, carrying them further from captivity and closer to the freedom they both deserved. And as the morning sun filtered through the canopy above, casting dappled light across their path, Elena allowed herself a moment of fierce, defiant hope. They weren't done yet, not by a long shot. The forest grew denser as Elena and Storm pushed deeper into its embrace, ancient trees rising on all sides like silent guardians. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in scattered beams, illuminating patches of mist that hung in the cool morning air. The sounds of pursuit had faded, but Elena knew better than to slow their pace. Wingate would have trackers, possibly even drones, scanning the forest for heat signatures. Storm moved with surprising confidence through the challenging terrain, navigating fallen logs and uneven ground, as if he had been born to the wilderness. His breathing remained steady, his gait smooth despite the difficult conditions. The experimental modifications to his vision were likely helping him. Now Elena realized allowing him to perceive the environment in ways a normal horse could not. She had no clear destination in mind, only the knowledge that they needed to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Wingate's forces. Sophia had mentioned mining roads and Forest Service trails. If they could find one, perhaps they could make their way to a road where Mason and Sophia might be able to rendezvous with them. The thought of her companions sent a pang of worry through Elena's chest. Had they escaped the tower, or had Hayes's men captured them? Taking the evidence they had so painstakingly gathered, Storm suddenly slowed his ears, pricking forward alertly. Elena tensed, scanning their surroundings for signs of danger. They had reached a small clearing where sunlight poured down unfiltered, illuminating a carpet of wild ferns and scattered wildflowers. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her hand moving instinctively to the shotgun strapped across her back. Storm's response was to turn his head, looking back the way they had come, with focused intensity. Elena followed his gaze but saw nothing unusual among the trees. Then she heard a faint but distinctive sound carried on the morning breeze. The rhythmic thump of helicopter rotors, still distant, but growing steadily closer. "They're not giving up easily," she murmured, patting Storm's neck. "Let's keep moving." They continued through the forest, maintaining as brisk a pace as the terrain would allow. Elena kept them under the densest parts of the canopy whenever possible, hoping the thick foliage would offer some protection from aerial surveillance. After what felt like hours, the trees began to thin, and Elena could make out what appeared to be a narrow track cutting through the underbrush, ahead an old logging road or game trail perhaps. It wasn't much, but it was better than forcing their way through trackless wilderness. As they emerged onto the path, Elena allowed Storm to slow to a walk, giving him a chance to recover his strength. The helicopter sounds had faded again, but she remained vigilant, knowing their pursuers would not abandon the search easily. The path gradually widened, showing signs of occasional use tire tracks in the muddy sections, branches cleared to allow passage. Elena's hopes rose slightly. This could be one of the Forest Service trails Sophia had mentioned. The crack of a branch snapping nearby froze them both in place. Storm's ears swiveled toward the sound, his body tensing beneath Elena. She reached for the shotgun, moving it into firing position as she scanned the surrounding forest. "Elena!" A voice called softly from the trees. "Don't shoot! It's me!" Relief flooded through her as Mason stepped onto the path, looking battered but very much alive. His shirt was torn and a fresh cut marked his cheek, but his eyes were clear and alert. "Mason," she breathed, lowering the weapon. "What happened? Where's Sophia?" "We got separated," he explained, approaching cautiously, his gaze darting to the sky periodically. Wingate hit the tower hard, at least a dozen operatives plus Hayes himself directing operations. Sophia headed west in the jeep, drawing most of them after her. "I doubled back on foot, hoping to find you." "Is she safe?" Elena asked, her concern genuine, despite having just met the woman. Mason's expression tightened. "Sophia can handle herself. She has escape routes planned all over these mountains, caches of supplies, burner phones. It's not the first time she's had to disappear." He stepped closer to Storm, examining the horse with a practiced eye. "How's he doing?" "Better than I would have expected," Elena admitted. "The terrain doesn't seem to slow him much. I think his modified vision helps him navigate." Mason nodded. The ocular enhancements were designed for exactly that, allowing the horses to operate effectively in any environment, any conditions. His hand moved to the speaker magnet still taped over Storm's implant. "This holding up?" "So far," Elena said. "No more seizures or distress behaviors." A distant sound caught their attention, the helicopter returning its rhythmic beats echoing through the forest canopy. "We need cover," Mason said, his voice tight with urgency. Elena scanned their surroundings, spotting a dense thicket of evergreens nearby. There, she pointed. We can wait them out. They led Storm into the natural shelter, the thick branches closing around them like a living fortress. Through gaps in the foliage, Elena could see patches of sky as the helicopter passed overhead, its shadow briefly darkening the forest floor before moving on. They're using thermal imaging, Mason said quietly. The canopy provides some concealment, but not enough. We need to keep moving once they've passed. Elena nodded, then remembered the USB drive Howard had given her. Did Sophia get a chance to look at Howard's files before Wingate arrived? Mason shook his head. No time. She grabbed all the evidence, including the drive, but we didn't have a chance to review anything. Do you have it? Elena asked. Sophia has it along with everything else. She's heading for a secure location where she can upload everything to encrypted servers. If she makes it, the evidence will be safe, even if we're caught. The helicopter's sound faded into the distance, and they emerged cautiously from their hiding place. The path stretched before them, winding deeper into the forest. Any idea where this trail leads? Elena asked as they resumed their journey. Mason walking beside Storm, while Elena remained mounted, ready to move quickly if needed. If I'm right about where we are, it should connect with Forest Road 27 in about 2 miles, Mason replied. From there, we can head north toward the old mining district. There's an abandoned processing facility that Sophia uses as a fallback position. If she managed to evade pursuit, that's where she'll go. And if she didn't, Mason's jaw tightened, then we're on our own. They continued in silence for a time, alert for any signs of pursuit. The forest around them was alive with natural sounds, birds calling, small creatures rustling in the underbrush, the gentle sigh of wind through the trees. It was peaceful, deceptively so, given the danger that stalked them. Tell me more about Hayes, Elena said finally, keeping her voice low. What drives a decorated military officer to sell dangerous technology to the highest bidder? Mason considered the question, his expression troubled. Hayes is brilliant. His work on biological countermeasures saved countless lives during his time at DARPA. But somewhere along the way, he became fixated on the idea that traditional military and intelligence agencies weren't doing enough to protect against emerging threats. So he decided to take matters into his own hands. Elena guessed. Essentially, yes. When the government started cutting funding for his more experimental approaches, he saw it as short-sightedness, a failure to recognize the changing nature of warfare. Wingate gave him the resources and autonomy to continue his work without oversight or ethical constraints. And the jump from defensive to offensive applications, Mason sighed, a sound heavy with disappointment. The line between defense and offense has always been blurry in his field. A vaccine delivery system can become a pathogen delivery system with minimal modifications. Hayes would argue he's simply being pragmatic, developing tools that can be used however the situation demands. That's a dangerous rationalization, Elena said, thinking of the weapons she had seen deployed during her time in Afghanistan, how each new technology was inevitably turned to ever more destructive purposes. The most dangerous people aren't those who set out to do evil, Mason replied grimly. They're the ones who convince themselves that wrong is right in service of some greater good. A sudden rustling in the trees ahead brought them to a halt. Storm's ears pricked forward, but he showed no signs of alarm, an encouraging sign. Moments later, a deer bounded across the path, pausing briefly to regard them with liquid dark eyes before disappearing into the forest. They both released the breath they had been holding, sharing a brief smile of relief. We're making good time, Mason observed, checking his watch. Another hour should bring us to the forest road if we can maintain this pace. As they continued, Elena found her thoughts turning to Howard. The last time she'd spoken to him, Wingate operatives had been in his home. What had happened after their call was cut off? Was he safe, or had Hayes' men taken him? Or worse? Mason, she said, her voice tight with concern. We need to find out what happened to Howard. Mason glanced up at her, his expression somber. I know, but right now our priority has to be getting Storm to safety and securing the evidence. That's what Howard would want. Elena knew he was right, but it did little to ease the knot of worry in her stomach. Howard had been a friend, perhaps her only real friend in Point Haven, and the thought that he might be suffering because he had helped them was unbearable. When we reached the mining facility, Mason continued as if sensing her inner conflict. We can try to make contact, find out what's happening in town. Sophia has communications equipment that can't be easily traced. It wasn't much, but it was something. Elena nodded, focusing her attention on the path ahead. One step at a time. Get to safety. Protect Storm. Then find Howard and make Hayes pay for whatever harm had come to the old man. They had been walking for perhaps half an hour when Storm suddenly halted, his entire body going rigid with attention. His head turned sharply to the left ears, swiveling to track something Elena couldn't perceive. "What is it?" she whispered, scanning the forest in the direction of Storm's focus. Mason had already drawn his weapon, moving into a defensive position with practiced ease. Could be anything: wildlife, Wingate personnel, other hikers. But Elena had learned to trust Storm's reactions. His heightened senses and modified vision allowed him to detect threats long before human awareness could register them. Something was out there, moving through the forest parallel to their path. She slid from Storm's back, the shotgun ready but not yet raised. "Cover me," she murmured to Mason. "I'm going to check it out." "Elena," he began, but she was already moving, slipping between the trees with the silent efficiency of a soldier trained for reconnaissance. The forest floor was soft beneath her feet, years of fallen pine needles creating a natural carpet that muffled her footsteps. She moved from tree to tree, using each massive trunk as cover, her senses hyper alert to any sign of danger. A flash of movement caught her eye, something dark moving through the underbrush about 50 yards ahead. She froze, becoming part of the forest's stillness, watching and waiting. There it was again, a human figure moving with careful deliberation, head turning periodically as if scanning the surroundings. The person was dressed in dark clothing, face obscured by what appeared to be a tactical cap and sunglasses. Wingate. They had teams on the ground, combing the forest methodically. Elena began to retreat, planning to warn Mason and find an alternate route. But as she turned, her foot came down on a dry branch, the crack of its breaking like a gunshot in the quiet forest. The figure ahead stopped instantly, turning toward the sound. Elena pressed herself against the nearest tree, hoping the dappled shadows would provide enough concealment. For a long moment, neither moved. Elena held her breath, feeling her heartbeat thudding in her ears. Then the figure began moving again, not away but directly toward her position. She had seconds to decide: retreat and potentially lead them back to Mason and Storm, or confront the threat head-on. The choice was clear. Elena stepped out from behind the tree, shotgun raised to her shoulder barrel, pointed squarely at the approaching figure. "That's far enough," she called, her voice steady and authoritative. The figure halted immediately, hands raising slightly in a universal gesture of non-aggression. "Easy," a female voice responded. "I'm not your enemy." "Remove your cap and glasses," Elena ordered, maintaining her aim. "Slowly." The woman complied, revealing a face that caused Elena's breath to catch in surprise. "Sophia," Sophia Reeves offered a tired smile, lowering her hands gradually. "In the flesh. Though I'd appreciate it if you'd lower that shotgun before we continue our reunion." Elena lowered the weapon, relief washing through her. "We thought you'd headed west in the Jeep." "I did," Sophia confirmed, approaching more comfortably now that the immediate threat of being shot had passed. "Led them on a merry chase for about 10 miles before I ditched the vehicle in a ravine and doubled back on foot. Most of Hayes' team is still searching the western quadrant of the forest. Mason is just back there with Storm," Elena said, gesturing toward the path. "We were heading for the mining facility you mentioned." Sophia nodded approvingly. "Good. That's still our best option. I have equipment there, supplies, secure communications." As they walked back toward Mason and Storm, Elena studied Sophia more carefully. The journalist moved with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to fieldwork, her footsteps nearly as silent as Elena's own. There was more to this woman than just investigative reporting. "You've done this before," Elena observed. "Evading pursuit, operating in hostile territory?" Sophia glanced at her, a hint of wariness in her expression. "I wasn't always a journalist. Before I started investigating corporate and government malfeasance, I worked elsewhere." "Intelligence community," Elena guessed. A small smile touched Sophia's lips. "Something like that. Let's just say I acquired certain skills that have proven useful in my current profession." They reached the path where Mason waited with Storm, his relief evident when he saw who accompanied Elena. "Sophia," he breathed, holstering his weapon. "You made it." Takes more than Hayes and his goon squad to catch me? She replied, though the fatigue in her voice belied her bravado. But we're not out of the woods yet, literally or figuratively. The mining facility, Mason asked. Sophia nodded. Still our best option. I have everything we need there to compile the evidence and make contact with my sources in Washington. What about Howard? Elena asked. He was with Wingate operatives when we last spoke to him. A shadow crossed Sophia's face. I've been monitoring emergency frequencies on my portable radio. There was a call about a disturbance at a residence in Point Haven, possible shots fired. The address matches Howard's home. Elena felt as if the ground had dropped away beneath her feet. Is he? I don't know, Sophia admitted. The transmissions were cryptic, typical police code, but it doesn't sound good. Mason placed a steadying hand on Elena's shoulder. We'll find out what happened, I promise. But right now we need to focus on reaching the facility safely. Elena nodded, pushing down the surge of emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. Howard had known the risk when he helped them. He would want them to continue to expose Wingate and prevent Hayes from weaponizing the technology further. They resumed their journey, moving with greater urgency now. Sophia took the lead, her knowledge of the terrain proving invaluable as she guided them along lesser-known game trails that paralleled the main path. Storm followed willingly, seeming to sense the importance of their mission. The forest gradually began to change around them, the tall pines giving way to scattered hardwoods that signaled they were approaching the edge of the old-growth section. Ahead, sunlight gleamed on what appeared to be a gravel surface, Forest Road 27. Wait, Sophia said, raising a hand to halt their progress. Let me check if it's clear. She moved forward cautiously, crouching low as she approached the road's edge. After a careful survey in both directions, she signaled for them to join her. The road looks clear, she reported, but we should cross quickly and continue through the forest on the other side. It's too exposed to travel along it for any distance. They crossed swiftly, Storm's hooves crunching briefly on the gravel, before they plunged back into the protective embrace of the trees. The terrain on this side was different, rockier, with steeper inclines that spoke of the area's mining history. How much farther? Elena asked, noting that the sun had passed its zenith and was beginning its descent toward the western horizon. About 3 miles, Sophia replied. There's a ridge ahead we need to cross, then down into a narrow valley where the processing facility is located. We should reach it before dusk if we maintain this pace. The ridge proved challenging, especially for Storm, but the horse navigated the rocky ascent with remarkable sure-footedness. From the summit, Elena could see for miles across the forested landscape, a breathtaking vista of green, rolling away to the distant coastline, where the Pacific Ocean glimmered like polished silver in the afternoon sun. But the beauty of the scene was marred by a more ominous sight, thin columns of smoke rising from what Elena estimated to be the direction of Point Haven. Something's burning, she said, pointing toward the distant smoke. Sophia pulled out a small pair of binoculars, focusing on the area. Multiple structures, she confirmed grimly. Hard to tell from this distance, but it looks like a significant fire. Howard's house, Elena asked, dread settling in her stomach. Impossible to say for sure, Sophia replied, lowering the binoculars. But the timing is concerning. Mason's expression had hardened, his jaw set in a tight line. Hayes is covering his tracks, eliminating evidence, witnesses, anything that could connect Wingate to illegal activities. All the more reason to get our evidence to the right people, Sophia said, stowing the binoculars. Before Hayes can silence everyone who knows the truth. They descended the ridge in somber silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Elena couldn't shake the image of Howard trapped in his burning home, the victim of forces he had tried to warn them about decades earlier. Had his past finally caught up with him, or had he managed to escape to find safety somewhere beyond Hayes's reach? The valley below was narrow and steep-sided, a natural fortress that had made it ideal for mining operations in the previous century. The processing facility occupied a cleared area near the valley floor, a collection of weathered buildings, rusting equipment, and crumbling infrastructure that nature was slowly reclaiming. Home sweet home, Sophia murmured as they approached the largest structure, a cavernous building that had once housed massive ore crushers and sorting machinery. Not exactly 5-star accommodations, but it has everything we need. The interior of the building was a stark contrast to its dilapidated exterior. Sophia had converted a section of the upper floor into a functional living and working space, complete with solar-powered electricity communications equipment and basic amenities. Impressive setup, Elena commented, taking in the array of technology that seemed oddly at home amid the industrial ruins. I've had to go off-grid more than once in my line of work. Sophia explained, moving to a sophisticated-looking communications console. This place has saved my life on several occasions. She powered up the equipment, the screens coming to life, with a soft electronic hum. First priority, check what's happening in Point Haven. Mason led Storm to a clear area where the horse could rest comfortably, removing the saddle and bridle and providing fresh water from a nearby barrel. Elena joined Sophia at the console, watching as the journalist accessed what appeared to be emergency service frequencies. There, Sophia said, adjusting a dial to clarify a staticky transmission. County Fire Department responding to multiple structure fires in Point Haven. At least 3 buildings affected. 1 confirmed fatality. Elena's heart seemed to stop in her chest. Howard? Sophia continued, listening, her expression grave. They're not identifying the victim yet, but one of the structures is on Maple Street. That's where Howard's hardware store is located. And his home is above the store. Elena said, her voice hollow. Mason joined them, his face etched with concern. Hayes is eliminating loose ends. Anyone connected to Storm or Wildlight who might talk. Which makes what we're doing even more important, Sophia said firmly, turning to another piece of equipment. We need to compile everything we have and get it to my contacts in Washington immediately. She inserted Howard's USB drive into a secure laptop, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she bypassed security protocols and accessed the contents. Let's see what was worth preserving for all these years. The screen filled with documents, research papers, personnel files, experimental protocols dating back to the early 1970s. Project Chimera, the header read on several files. My God, Sophia breathed, scrolling through the materials. This is a gold mine. Detailed documentation of early biological delivery systems, experimental protocols, official authorization for human testing. Howard was right in the middle of it. Human testing? Elena asked, a chill running down her spine. Sophia nodded grimly, opening a personnel file that contained a much younger Howard Mackenzie's photograph. According to this, Howard wasn't just a researcher on Project Chimera. He was the principal scientist, the one who developed the theoretical framework for using biological organisms as delivery systems for vaccines and other compounds. The precursor to Wildlight, Mason observed, leaning closer to study the documents. Exactly, Sophia confirmed. But Howard shut it down when he realized the military was more interested in the offensive applications than the defensive ones. He buried the research, redacted the most dangerous elements from the official reports, and walked away. She glanced up at Elena. That's why he recognized what was happening with Storm immediately. He'd seen it all before his own work twisted into something he never intended. Elena thought of the quiet, unassuming man who had run the hardware store in Point Haven, who had brought her medication when she refused to see a doctor, who had sat with her on her worst nights when the memories threatened to drown her. How many secrets had he carried all those years? There's more, Sophia said, opening another file. Financial records, internal memos. Howard was tracking Wildlight for years. He knew Hayes was privatizing the research, selling it to foreign interests. He was building a case. But why didn't he go public with it? Mason asked. With evidence like this, he could have shut down the entire operation years ago. Sophia's expression was grim as she opened another document, a classified personnel file for Commander James Hayes. Because Hayes was originally his protege, Howard recruited him to DARPA, mentored him, believed in his potential. He was trying to find a way to stop him without destroying him completely. A mistake that may have cost Howard his life, Elena said quietly. A beeping sound from another console interrupted them, an alert from the perimeter security system Sophia had installed around the facility. We've got company, she announced, moving quickly to check the surveillance feed. The screen showed a small drone hovering at the edge of the valley, its camera scanning methodically. Wingate drone. They're sweeping the area. Can it detect us inside the building? Elena asked, already moving toward where Storm stood ready to flee if necessary. The structure's metal framework should mask heat signatures, Sophia replied. But we can't count on that. If they're using more advanced scanning technology, she didn't need to finish the thought. If Wingate had deployed their cutting-edge surveillance equipment, no conventional hiding place would conceal them for long. Options? Mason asked, his military training evident in his crisp assessment of the situation. Sophia considered briefly. I need about 20 minutes to upload everything to my secure servers and contact my sources in Washington. Once the information is out there, Hayes can't put the genie back in the bottle. So we need to buy you time, Elena concluded. A diversion. I can lead them away, Mason suggested. Take Storm and head north while you two complete the upload, and then go south. Elena shook her head firmly. No, we're not splitting up again, and I'm not leaving Storm. The horse had moved to stand beside her, as if understanding he was the topic of discussion. His dark eyes regarded them all with that unsettling intelligence, his ears pricked forward attentively. An idea began to form in Elena's mind, dangerous perhaps, even foolish, but with potential. The implant, she said, looking at Storm's neck, where the speaker magnet remained taped in place. It's still inside him, just temporarily disabled. What are you suggesting? Mason asked warily. If we remove the magnet, the implant might reactivate, at least partially. Wingate could detect the signal and follow it, Sophia finished, understanding dawning. But away from here, giving us the time we need. It's too risky, Mason objected. For Storm especially. You saw what happened when the implant tried to reactivate before. It caused him significant distress. Elena moved to Storm's side, placing a gentle hand on his neck. I'm not suggesting we leave the implant active for long, just enough to create a false trail. Lead them away from the facility while Sophia completes the upload. And who's going to accompany Storm on this decoy mission? Mason demanded. Who's going to protect him if Hayes' team catches up? I will, Elena said simply. Storm trusts me. We've come this far together. I won't abandon him now. Mason looked as if he wanted to argue further, but something in Elena's expression must have convinced him of her resolve. At least let me come with you, he said, his voice softer now. Two have a better chance than one. Elena shook her head. Sophia needs protection too. If Hayes figures out what we're doing, he'll send teams here to stop the upload at any cost. The drone had moved closer to the facility, its camera sweeping across the exterior of the buildings with methodical precision. We're out of time to debate, Sophia said urgently. If we're doing this, it needs to be now. Elena met Storm's gaze silently, asking if he understood what she was proposing, if he was willing to take the risk. The horse nickered softly, pressing his muzzle against her shoulder in what felt remarkably like consent. All right, she said, reaching for the makeshift magnet arrangement on Storm's neck. Here's the plan. I'll take Storm out the north exit away from the valley. Once we're clear, I'll remove the magnet long enough for Wingate to detect the signal. We'll lead them on a chase for as long as we can, then reapply the magnet and lose them in the forest. How will you find your way back? Mason asked, concern evident in his voice. There's an old fire lookout about 10 miles northeast of here, Sophia said, moving to a map spread on a nearby table. She marked the location with a pen. It's abandoned but still structurally sound. If you can make it there, we'll rendezvous once the upload is complete. Elena studied the map, committing the route to memory. How long will the upload take? 20 minutes for the files, another 10 to make secure contact with my sources, Sophia estimated. Say 40 minutes total to be safe. Then that's how long we need to keep them busy. Elena said, already gathering supplies, water, a basic first aid kit, extra ammunition for the shotgun. Mason approached her as she prepared to leave, his expression troubled. Elena, this is necessary, she finished for him. And it's my choice. Storm and we understand each other. We can do this. He held her gaze for a long moment, then nodded once, accepting her decision. Be careful. Hayes won't hesitate to use lethal force if he catches you. Then we won't get caught. Elena replied, summoning a confidence she didn't entirely feel. She turned to Storm, who stood ready, somehow seeming to grasp the importance of their mission. Ready, boy! The horse nickered softly, tossing his head as if eager to be moving. Sophia pressed a small radio into Elena's hand. One-way communication, receive only. I'll broadcast when the upload is complete, so you'll know when it's safe to disable the implant permanently. Good luck, Mason said as Elena mounted Storm, settling into the saddle with practiced ease. You too, she replied. See you at the lookout. Akini. With a final nod to her companions, Elena guided Storm toward the northern exit of the facility, a large loading bay, where ore trucks had once departed with their valuable cargo. Now it would serve as the launching point for a different kind of precious cargo, the truth about Project Wildlight and the hope for Storm's permanent freedom. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as they emerged from the building, keeping close to the rocky walls to avoid being spotted by the drones still circling overhead. Storm moved with remarkable stealth for such a large animal, his hooves nearly silent on the soft earth. Once they had put sufficient distance between themselves and the facility, Elena brought Storm to a halt in a small clearing surrounded by dense evergreens. The moment of truth had arrived. This is going to be unpleasant, she told him softly, her hand hovering over the magnet. But I promise I'll replace it as soon as possible. We just need to give them something to chase, something other than our friends. Storm stood perfectly still, his dark eyes fixed on her with complete trust. Elena took a deep breath and carefully peeled back the tape securing the speaker magnet to his neck. The effect was almost immediate. Storm's body tensed, a tremor running through his powerful frame as the implant reactivated. The small device began to glow with that same pulsing light they had observed earlier, its circuits re-establishing connections with the surrounding neural tissue. Elena quickly remounted, knowing they needed to be moving before the discomfort became too great for Storm to function effectively. Let's go, she urged, guiding him northward at a brisk trot. Just a little while, then we can shut it down again. They had covered perhaps half a mile when the drone appeared above the tree line, behind them moving with purposeful speed. It had detected the implant's signal just as Elena had hoped. They've taken the bait, she murmured, urging Storm into a canter. Now let's give them a proper chase. The forest opened before them as they ran, Storm's powerful strides eating up the distance. Despite the discomfort he must have been feeling from the reactivated implant, he moved with determination and strength, as if understanding the importance of their mission. Behind them, the drone maintained pursuit, staying just close enough to track them, but not so close as to reveal its presence. Elena knew it was relaying their position to ground teams, who would be converging on their location with vehicles and possibly even helicopters. Good. The more resources Hayes committed to chasing them, the fewer he would have available to attack the mining facility. They pushed on through the forest, following game trails when available, forging their own path when necessary. Storm's enhanced vision proved invaluable, allowing him to navigate obstacles that would have slowed or stopped a normal horse. After what Elena judged to be about 20 minutes halfway through Sophia's estimated upload time, she brought Storm to a temporary halt in a dense thicket, giving him a brief rest while they remained hidden from aerial observation. You're doing great, she told him, stroking his neck soothingly. She could feel the heat emanating from the implant, see the discomfort in Storm's eyes. Not much longer now. The radio at her belt crackled suddenly, Sophia's voice coming through with surprising clarity given their remote location. Elena, if you can hear this, we have a problem. Hayes' team has found the facility. Mason is holding them off, but the upload is only at 60%. We need more time. Elena's heart sank. Their diversion hadn't worked as well as they'd hoped. Perhaps Hayes had split his forces, sending teams in both directions, rather than committing fully to the implant's signal. Change of plans, she told Storm, remounting quickly. We need to make some noise, draw more attention our way. They set off again, this time heading toward what appeared to be a logging area ahead, a clearing where heavy equipment stood idle, awaiting the next day's work. If they could trigger the equipment's security systems, create enough of a disturbance. The drone had reacquired them, following at a discreet distance. Elena pushed Storm to a gallop, breaking cover and heading directly for the logging camp. As they approached, she could see security lights, a small office trailer, several massive machines used for cutting and moving timber. Perfect. She guided Storm straight through the camp, weaving between the parked equipment, making no attempt at stealth. Within seconds, motion-activated floodlights blazed to life, illuminating the area in harsh white light. An alarm began to wail, a high piercing sound that cut through the quiet forest like a knife. That should get their attention, Elena murmured, turning Storm toward the forest on the far side of the camp. She could already hear the distant thrum of helicopter rotors wingate, responding to the disturbance with aerial resources. The radio crackled again. Upload at 75%, Sophia reported. Hayes has diverted forces your way. Whatever you did, it's working. But we need at least 10 more minutes. 10 minutes. Elena surveyed their surroundings, looking for somewhere to make a stand. Somewhere they could be visible enough to keep Wingate's attention. Without being so exposed, they would be immediately captured. A ridge rose to their left, its summit bare of trees and offering a commanding view of the surrounding forest. If they positioned themselves there, they would be visible for miles, a tempting target that Hayes couldn't ignore. Up there, she told Storm, guiding him toward the slope. We make ourselves seen by Sophia the time she needs, then disappear back into the forest. The ascent was steep, challenging, even for Storm's impressive strength and agility. By the time they reached the summit, Elena could see the helicopter approaching from the direction of Point Haven, its searchlight sweeping the forest below. Here we go, she said, positioning Storm at the highest point of the ridge. Let them see us. The implant in Storm's neck glowed visibly now, pulsing with increased intensity, as if responding to their exposed position. Elena kept one hand on the speaker magnet, ready to reapply it the moment Sophia gave the signal that the upload was complete. The helicopter spotted them almost immediately, banking sharply to approach the ridge. In the fading daylight, Elena could make out the Wingate logo on its side, sleek and corporate, betraying nothing of the darkness that lay beneath the company's polished exterior. Through the cockpit window, she caught a glimpse of a face she recognized from Sophia's evidence wall commander, James Hayes himself, directing the operation from the air. Their eyes met across the distance, and Elena felt a chill at the cold determination she saw there. This man had ordered Howard's death, had tortured and experimented on Storm, and other animals, had betrayed his country by selling dangerous technology to the highest bidder. And now he was coming for them to eliminate the final witnesses to his crimes. The radio crackled urgently. Upload complete, Sophia's voice triumphant despite the static. Files secured and transmitted. Disable the implant and get out of there. We'll meet at the rendezvous point. Relief flooded through Elena. They had done it. The evidence was safe beyond Hayes' reach. Now they just needed to escape. She reached for the speaker magnet, ready to reapply it to Storm's neck and shut down the implant permanently. But before she could act, the helicopter banked sharply, positioning itself directly above them. A side door slid open, revealing a man holding what appeared to be a small electronic device. Storm reacted instantly, his body going rigid, eyes rolling back in sudden distress. A terrible sound escaped him, not a normal horse's cry, but a keening wail of pure agony. Storm! Elena cried, dropping the magnet in her haste to steady him as he staggered beneath her. What's happening? The answer came in a voice amplified by the helicopter's external speakers, Hayes, his tone clinical and detached, despite the cruelty of his actions. Asset WL-422 is programmed to respond to specific frequencies, he announced as if delivering a lecture. The neural implant includes a fail-safe protocol, quite painful, I'm afraid, but necessary for situations exactly like this one. Elena clung to Storm as he shuddered violently, fighting to remain on his feet despite the agony clearly coursing through him. The implant in his neck was glowing fiercely now, pulsing in rhythm with whatever signal the device in the helicopter was emitting. Surrender the asset, Hayes continued, and I'll deactivate the protocol. Continue to resist, and WL-422 will experience increasingly severe neural disruption until system failure occurs. He was talking about killing Storm, burning out his nervous system through deliberate overstimulation of the implant. Elena had seen Storm's reaction to the implant's normal functions. This weaponized activation was exponentially worse. The helicopter descended lower, kicking up dust and debris from the ridgetop. Armed men were visible in the doorway, now preparing to deploy and capture them both. Elena's mind raced, searching desperately for options. They couldn't outrun the helicopter, not with Storm in this condition. Fighting was equally futile. She was outnumbered and outgunned. The speaker magnet lay on the ground where she had dropped it, just beyond reach. If she could retrieve it, reapply it to Storm's implant, it might disrupt the signal long enough for them to escape. But that would require dismounting, leaving Storm vulnerable. A sudden calm descended over Elena, clarity emerging from the chaos of the moment. She knew what needed to be done. I'm sorry, she whispered to Storm, leaning close to his ear. This is going to hurt, but it's the only way. Before Hayes or his men could react, Elena drew her knife and pressed the blade directly against the implant in Storm's neck. The horse shuddered beneath her, but held steady as if understanding her intent and giving consent. With a swift, precise motion born of her medical training, Elena cut into the skin surrounding the implant. Blood welled immediately, but she pressed on, working the blade beneath the edge of the device, leveraging it upward. The helicopter hovered closer, Hayes' voice shouting orders to stop her, to secure the asset at all costs. But it was too late. With a final twist of the blade, Elena pried the implant free from Storm's flesh. It came away in a spray of blood, still glowing and pulsing with malevolent energy. Without hesitation, she flung it as far as she could, watching with grim satisfaction as it arced through the air and disappeared into the forest below. Storm reared powerfully, a cry of pain and liberation, escaping him as he broke free from the technology that had bound him for so long. When his hooves touched earth again, there was a new wildness in his stance, a fierce determination in his eyes. "Run!" Elena urged, securing the knife and gripping his mane as he wheeled and plunged down the far side of the ridge, away from the helicopter and into the sheltering darkness of the forest. Behind them, Hayes was shouting orders, the helicopter attempting to follow, but the dense canopy made aerial pursuit nearly impossible. Storm ran as if newly born, each powerful stride, carrying them deeper into wilderness and further from captivity. Elena clung to his back, one hand pressed against the wound on his neck to slow the bleeding. The cut was clean and precise, it would heal with minimal scarring. More importantly, Storm was free, truly free, for the first time since Wingate had captured and modified him. As darkness enveloped the forest completely, they slowed to a more sustainable pace. Elena oriented herself using the stars visible through breaks in the canopy, guiding Storm toward the rendezvous point Sophia had indicated, the abandoned fire lookout, where with luck, Mason and Sophia would be waiting with news of the evidence's successful delivery to authorities. The night wrapped around them like a protective cloak, the sounds of pursuit fading into the distance. Storm moved with confidence, despite the darkness, his strides sure and purposeful. Without the implant, he could no longer see infrared or other enhanced spectra, but he seemed unbothered by this return to normal, equine vision. "We did it," Elena told him softly, patting his neck as they navigated a shallow stream crossing. "We got the evidence out. Hayes can't hide anymore." Storm nickered softly in response, ears flicking back toward her voice. The connection between them remained undiminished by the removal of the implant. If anything, it seemed stronger, now purified by shared danger and mutual trust. As they climbed a gentle slope toward what Elena hoped was the fire lookout, she found herself thinking of Howard. Had he known it would come to this when he first recognized what Storm was? Had he foreseen his own fate, accepting it as the price of setting right the wrongs his early research had enabled? The answers to these questions might never come, but Elena took comfort in knowing that Howard's final act had been one of courage and redemption, providing the evidence that would expose Project Wildlight and prevent Hayes from weaponizing the technology further. The lookout tower appeared silhouetted against the night sky, a solitary structure standing tall among the surrounding trees. As they approached, Elena saw lights glowing from its windows, a welcome beacon in the wilderness. "We're here," she told Storm, dismounting stiffly after the long, arduous ride. Her leg throbbed painfully, reminding her of old injuries and new strains, but she pushed the discomfort aside. "Let's see if our friends made it too." The door of the lookout opened as they approached, light spilling out onto the small clearing. Mason stood framed in the doorway, relief evident on his face as he recognized them. "Elena," he called, hurrying down the steps to meet them. "Thank God. We weren't sure you'd make it." "Neither were we," Elena admitted, leading Storm toward the tower. "Hayes found us on the ridge. He activated some kind of failsafe in the implant." Mason's expression darkened. "The neural disruptor. It was designed as a last resort if a subject went rogue or fell into enemy hands." "Well, it's not a concern anymore," Elena said, turning Storm slightly to show the bandage she had applied to his neck during a brief stop. "The implant is gone permanently." Mason's eyes widened in surprise. "You removed it in the field. That's what needed to be done," Elena finished simply. "How, Sophia, did the evidence get through?" "See for yourself," Mason said, gesturing toward the lookout. Inside, Sophia sat surrounded by communications equipment, her face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple screens. She looked up as they entered, exhaustion evident in her features, but a fierce satisfaction burning in her eyes. "You made it," she said, rising to greet them. "And from the look of things, you did more than just escape." Elena nodded toward the equipment. The evidence, safely delivered to 3 separate oversight committees, 2 investigative journalists at major publications, and a special prosecutor I've worked with before, Sophia confirmed. "Hayes is finished. The story is breaking even as we speak." She turned one of the screens toward Elena, showing a news website with a bold headline: "Whistleblowers expose illegal bioweapon program at government contractor." It worked. Elena breathed, a weight lifting from her shoulders. It actually worked. Howard's files were the key, Sophia said, her voice softening. The historical context they provided, the clear progression from his original research to Hayes's perversion of it, it made the case irrefutable. "Have you heard anything about Howard?" Elena asked the question she had been dreading but needed to ask. Sophia and Mason exchanged a glance, their expressions grave. "There was a body recovered from his home," Mason said gently. "The authorities haven't released an official identification yet, but—" Elena nodded, accepting the unspoken conclusion. Howard was gone, another casualty in Hayes's desperate attempt to cover his tracks. "He knew the risks," she said quietly. "He made his choice." "A brave one," Sophia added. "His evidence was crucial. Without it, Hayes might have been able to deny involvement claim. Rogue elements were operating without his knowledge." Outside, Storm nickered softly, drawing their attention. Elena moved to the window, watching as the horse stood in the moonlight, his dark coat gleaming silver at the edges, his head raised toward the stars. "What happens now?" she asked, not taking her eyes off Storm. "To him, I mean." "That's up to you," Mason said, joining her at the window. "The evidence is out there. Hayes will be arrested. Wingate's operations suspended pending investigation. Storm is free." "Free to do what?" Elena wondered aloud. "He's not a normal horse anymore. The modifications they made, the training he received, he can't just go back to being wild." "No," Sophia agreed, "but he doesn't have to. There are sanctuaries for animals like him, places where he could live safely, protected from those who might still see him as valuable for his enhancements." Elena considered this, watching as Storm moved with easy grace around the clearing, exploring his surroundings with the curiosity of a being newly liberated. There was something profoundly moving about his resilience, his capacity to embrace freedom despite all he had endured. Or, Mason suggested quietly, he could stay with someone who understands him, someone he trusts. Elena turned to look at him, surprised by the suggestion. "You mean me?" Mason smiled slightly. "You two have been through hell together, created a bond I've never seen between human and animal. Maybe that's worth preserving." The idea took root in Elena's mind, growing with unexpected strength. Return to Point Haven. Create a place where Storm could live safely, where perhaps other animals who had suffered similar fates might find sanctuary. It seemed impossible, yet strangely right. A new purpose to replace the one she had lost in Afghanistan. A chance to heal others, and in doing so, perhaps heal herself. "I'd need help," she said, the idea solidifying as she spoke. "Resources, expertise." "You'd have it," Sophia assured her. "The story of what Wingate did to these animals, what you and Storm endured to expose the truth, it will resonate with people. There would be support." Elena stepped outside, drawn to Storm as if by an invisible thread. He approached her, immediately pressing his muzzle against her shoulder in that now familiar gesture of affection and trust. "What do you think?" she asked him softly. "Ready to start over. Build something new." Storm's response was to lower his head, bringing his eyes level with hers. In that dark, intelligent gaze, Elena saw not just understanding, but something that looked remarkably like hope, the same fragile, tentative hope beginning to bloom within her own heart. Dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon, painting the sky in bands of gold and rose that promised a new day. Elena stood with her hand resting lightly on Storm's neck, feeling the strong, steady pulse of life beneath her fingers. They had survived not just the immediate danger, but the deeper wounds that had threatened to define them both. Storm, the captive experiment who had chosen freedom at any cost. Elena, the sole survivor haunted by those she couldn't save. Together, perhaps they could build something meaningful from the broken pieces of their past. A sanctuary not just for modified animals, but for damaged souls of all kinds, a place where healing was possible, where being the one left behind didn't mean being alone. The future stretched before them, uncertain but full of possibility. And for the first time in years, Elena Kowalski faced it, not with dread, but with quiet determination. Whatever came next, they would meet it together, two survivors against the tide finding their way home at last. The sun rises differently now over Point Haven. Its light catches on the weathered sign at the entrance to New Horizons Sanctuary, where broken beings come to be made whole again. Elena still limps slightly as she walks the fence line each morning. The physical wounds may never fully heal, but the weight she carried, the crushing guilt of being the one left behind, has lightened with each passing day. In the meadow, Storm gallops freely, leading a small herd of rescued horses. The scar on his neck where the implant once controlled him is barely visible now. Like Elena, he carries his past not as a burden, but as proof of what he survived. They saved each other, these two wandering souls. One pulled from raging waters, the other from the depths of isolation. Both forever changed by forces beyond their control, yet ultimately defined by the choices they made when it mattered most. Perhaps that's what healing truly means. Not the absence of scars, but the courage to wear them openly. Not forgetting the pain, but finding purpose within it. And in those quiet moments when dusk settles over the sanctuary, when the boundary between sky and sea blurs into infinity, one question remains. What storms might we weather? What heights might we reach if only we found the courage to trust again?